Welcome to Myths for Mindfulness. If this is your first time here, this channel exists for one simple purpose: to give you something gentle to rest your mind on. History, mythology, stories from the ancient and medieval world, told slowly and quietly at the pace that the late hours deserve. No urgency, no noise, just the long, patient story of the human world, told in the dark, for those who need something to carry them towards sleep. Tonight, we are going to travel through the medieval world together. We have 10 stories to tell, 10 moments where the course of history turned, where something ended and something else began, where the world we live in now took one more step toward becoming itself. We will begin in the 8th century and end in the 15th. We will visit battles and basilicas, water meadows and open steppe, play quiet streets and the walls of the greatest city in the medieval world. We will move slowly. There is no hurry here. If this kind of company helps you, if these quiet hours with history and story make the night a little easier, then please do consider subscribing to Myths for Mindfulness. It costs you nothing, and it means these videos can keep being made, and this quiet corner of the internet can keep existing for everyone who needs it. And now, let us begin. The year is 732. The place is Francia, and somewhere in the golden autumn countryside of what we would now call central France, 2 armies are preparing to meet. Chapter 1. The Battle of Tours. Our first stop is a field in what is now central France. The year is 732, late October. The trees along the river Vienne would have been deep in their autumn colors, amber and rust and soft gold, and the air would have carried that particular chill that tells you summer is truly over. Somewhere near the town of Tours, or perhaps closer to Poitiers, the sources are not entirely certain, and that vagueness itself is rather fitting for such a distant era. 2 armies were preparing to meet. One of them had come a very long way. To understand what was happening in that autumn field, we have to go back a little further. About a century earlier, in the deserts of Arabia, a new faith had ignited the world. Islam, carried first by the Prophet Muhammad and then by his successors, had spread with breathtaking speed. By the early 8th century, Muslim armies had swept across the Middle East, across the vast sweep of North Africa, and then, in 711, across the narrow strait of water that separates Africa from Europe, into Iberia, the land we now call Spain and Portugal. The Visigothic kingdom that had ruled Iberia crumbled with remarkable swiftness. Within a few years, most of the peninsula was under the authority of the Umayyad Caliphate, one of the great empires of the medieval world, stretching from the borders of India in the east all the way to the Atlantic coast in the west. And still, the expansion continued. North of Iberia lay the Pyrenees Mountains, a great natural wall, yes, but not an impassable one. Umayyad forces crossed them. They raided deep into what the Romans had once called Gaul, the land of the Franks. Towns were taken, monasteries were plundered, the city of Bordeaux fell. And leading this particular campaign was a man named Abd al-Rahman al-Ghaffaq, the governor of Al-Andalus, the Muslim name for Iberia. A capable and experienced commander, he was moving north, toward Tours, toward the great and wealthy Abbey of St. Martin, one of the most sacred sites in Frankish Christianity, and a place of considerable treasure. Standing in his way was a man whose very name suggests something of his character, Charles, and the word that would later attach itself to him like a second skin. Martel, the hammer. Charles Martel was not a king, not in title anyway. He was the mayor of the palace, which sounds like a rather domestic position, but was in practice the most powerful role in the Frankish realm. The Frankish kings of this period were largely ceremonial figures, carried about on ox carts for important occasions, but otherwise without much real authority. The actual business of governing, of fighting, of holding the kingdom together, that fell to men like Charles. And Charles was very good at it. He had spent years campaigning across the Frankish lands, subduing rival factions, pushing back enemies on multiple frontiers. He was not a man who was easily rattled. When word reached him that a large Umayyad force had crossed the Pyrenees and was moving through his territory, he gathered his forces and marched south to meet them. The two armies found each other somewhere in that rolling countryside between Tours and Poitiers, and for several days, perhaps as many as 7, according to some sources, they simply watched one another. Skirmishes, yes, probing movements, the careful chess of armies feeling out terrain and temperament, but no great decisive clash, not yet. The Frankish forces held to higher ground. Charles, it seems, preferred to let the landscape work for him, rather than rushing into the open. His army was composed largely of infantry, foot soldiers in dense, disciplined formations. The Umayyad forces had cavalry, swift, mobile, experienced riders who'd proven devastating in battle after battle across 2 continents. What happened next is described in our sources with rather more drama than detail, which is almost always the way with medieval battles. The great clash came. The Frankish lines held. Again and again, the Umayyad cavalry struck against those lines, and again they found them unyielding. One chronicle, written not long after the battle, describes the Franks as standing together like a wall of ice, immovable, solid, cold. It is a striking image, a wall of ice in an autumn field. At some point during the fighting, word spread through the Umayyad ranks that their camp, where their considerable plunder from the campaign was being held, was under attack. Some of the cavalry wheeled away from the main battle to protect their treasures, and in that moment of confusion, that fracturing of momentum, the tide shifted. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiq rode to rally his men, to restore order and push. The assault forward once more, and there, in the chaos of that autumn battle, he was killed, thrown from his horse, surrounded, cut down. The death of a commander in the middle of a medieval battle was rarely something an army could simply absorb and continue. Word spread fast. The Umayyad forces began to fall back, and then to retreat in earnest. Night fell, which gave them cover, and by morning, when the Franks cautiously advanced, expecting a renewed assault, they found the enemy camp abandoned. The tents were still standing, the fires had burned low, but the army was gone, withdrawn back toward Iberia in the darkness. Charles Martel stood in that field and had won, though perhaps he was not entirely sure yet what he had won. In the years and centuries that followed, historians would argue about that question with considerable energy. To the Franks who wrote about it shortly afterward, the battle was a moment of divine deliverance, God's hand turning back an invading force, protecting the holy places of Christendom. The Abbey of St. Martin had been spared. Charles had demonstrated both his military genius and, in the eyes of the Church, his role as protector of the faithful. Later, historians, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, would frame the Battle of Tours in enormous, almost cosmic terms, as the moment that decided the fate of Western civilization. Edward Gibbon, the great English historian, wrote with his characteristic rhetorical grandeur that had Charles failed that day, the Quran might have been taught in the schools of Oxford, and the interpretation of scripture would have reached the shores of Scotland. A dramatic image, a memorable one. But history, as it so often does, resists the clean simplicity of dramatic images. More recent scholarship has gently but firmly complicated the picture. For one thing, it is not entirely clear that the Umayyad force at Tours was a full-scale invasion aimed at the conquest of Gaul. There is a reasonable argument that it was, in large part, a very significant raid, a deep push into Frankish territory to gather wealth and test the limits of expansion, rather than a campaign designed to plant a permanent flag north of the Pyrenees. For another, the Umayyad Caliphate was, by the 730s, beginning to feel the strains of overextension. It was a vast empire, and vast empires have vast problems. There were rebellions to suppress, frontiers to manage in the east, political tensions at the center. Whether or not Charles had met them at Tours, the days of rapid westward expansion were perhaps already drawing to a natural close. And then there is the matter of what actually changed and what didn't. Muslim forces continued to operate north of the Pyrenees for some decades after 732. Charles himself fought further campaigns against them. The battle was not a single clean ending, and yet, something did happen in that field near Tours and Poitiers. Something real. The northward momentum, the sense that the Umayyad advance was an unstoppable tide, broke. A boundary was, in practice, if not in formal treaty, established. The world north of the Pyrenees would remain, broadly speaking, a Latin Christian world. The Frankish kingdom would survive, and from it would eventually grow the empire of Charlemagne, Charles Martel's grandson, and from that, in ways both direct and winding, the shape of medieval Europe itself. Charles Martel's victory gave the Frankish realm time to consolidate, time to grow strong, time to become something. And in history, time is perhaps the most valuable thing of all. The field where it happened is quiet now, farmland mostly, in the gentle hills of the Vienne department in western France. If you stood there on an October evening, you might feel the same chill in the air that those soldiers felt 12 centuries ago, the same amber light, the same sense of the year turning. There is no great monument, no dramatic memorial to mark the spot, partly because we are not entirely sure which spot it was. History, particularly history so old, keeps its secrets. But the world that emerged from that autumn day is the world that built the cathedrals, wrote the manuscripts, sang the hymns, and eventually, in ways none of those soldiers could have imagined, became the world you are lying in right now. 12 centuries of consequence, traced back to a field, an army, a hammer of a man, and a morning when the enemy camp was found abandoned and cold. Rest now for a moment. Let that settle. When you are ready, we will move on, further into the medieval world, further into the quiet deep past. But there is no hurry. The next story will wait for you. Chapter 2. Charlemagne crowned emperor. We left the last story in a field in Francia, an autumn field, quiet after battle, with the fires of an abandoned camp burning low. That was 732. The man who stood in that field, Charles Martel, the hammer, would live another 14 years, fighting, governing, holding together the great unruly patchwork of the Frankish realm. He never took the title of king. He didn't need to. Everyone knew who held the power. When he died in 741, he left that power to his sons, and his sons passed it, in time, to their own children. And so the line continued, generation by generation, the way all things in history continue, quietly, incrementally, one life handing something to the next. Until, in 768, a young man came to rule the Franks, who would take everything his grandfather had built and expand it into something so large, so consequential, so deeply woven into the fabric of European history that we are still living in its aftermath today. His name, in the Latin that scholars and churchmen used, was Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, Charlemagne. To understand what happened on Christmas Day in the year 800, we have to spend a little time with the man himself, because Charlemagne is one of those figures from the deep past who refuses to stay distant. He keeps reaching forward through the centuries, touching things, shaping things, demanding to be reckoned with. He was, by all accounts, a physically imposing man. His biographer, Æthelred, who knew him personally and wrote about him with evident admiration, describes him as tall, broad-shouldered, with bright, animated eyes and a presence that filled whatever room he entered. He was energetic in a way that seems almost exhausting to read about. He campaigned almost every year of his reign. He crossed rivers, climbed mountains, slept in tents, and drove his armies across distances that would have seemed extraordinary, even to the Romans whose legacy he was, in many ways, inheriting. He was also, and this is important, genuinely curious. He wanted to learn. He surrounded himself with scholars, drawing them from across Europe, from England, from Ireland, from Italy, and established what became known as the Carolingian Renaissance, a flowering of learning and manuscript culture at his court in Aachen, in what is now Western Germany. He reportedly tried to learn to write in his later years, keeping wax tablets under his pillow so he could practice in the night. Æthelred tells us, with quiet tenderness, that he never quite managed it. His hand had held a sword for too long. But he could read, and he listened, and he thought. By the year 800, Charlemagne's kingdom had grown into something that hadn't been seen in Western Europe since the fall of Rome more than 3 centuries earlier. He ruled Francia, the old Frankish heartland. He had conquered the Lombards in Italy after their king threatened the papacy, and had been awarded the title of Patrician of the Romans by a grateful pope. He had fought brutal decades-long campaigns against the Saxons to his east, eventually bringing them, by a combination of military force and sometimes coercive conversion, into the Frankish Christian world. He had pushed into Spain, establishing a buffer zone against the Umayyad Emirate to the south. He had subdued the Avars on his eastern frontier. The kingdom was vast. It covered, roughly speaking, most of modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and northern Italy, with fingers reaching further in every direction. And at his center was a man who was, in almost every practical sense, already an emperor, already ruling a realm that dwarfed any other power in Latin Christendom. All that was missing was the word. The story of how the word was finally given involves, as so many great historical moments do, a crisis that nobody entirely planned for. In Rome, the situation had become difficult. Pope Leo III was in serious trouble. He had enemies within the Roman nobility, rivals who accused him of various offences, who had at one point physically attacked him in the street, allegedly attempting to blind him and cut out his tongue, the traditional Byzantine punishment for deposed officials. Leo had fled. He had made his way north to Charlemagne's court at Paderborn and appealed for help. Charlemagne, ever the pragmatist, ever the protector of the church, had intervened. He sent Leo back to Rome with a Frankish escort, and then, in the autumn of 800, made the journey south himself, ostensibly to hold an inquiry into the accusations against the Pope, to restore order, and to celebrate Christmas in the Holy City. What exactly was planned, and by whom, and how far in advance, is one of the most pleasantly debated questions in medieval history. Christmas Day, 800. The great Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. Not the vast Renaissance building that stands there today, but the older, humbler structure that had stood since the days of Constantine, its walls hung with mosaics and lamplight, its air thick with incense and the breath of a winter congregation. Charlemagne was attending Mass. He knelt as the faithful kneel in prayer. And Pope Leo III stepped forward and placed a crown upon his head. The congregation, or at least those who had been prepared for this moment, cried out 3 times, Carolo Augusto, Adeo Coronato, Magno et Pacifico Imperatori, Vita et Victoria, to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful emperor, life and victory. And in that moment, whether Charlemagne had expected it or not, the Western Roman Empire had, in a sense, returned. Charlemagne's own reaction to the coronation is one of the most intriguing details in Einhard's biography. Einhard tells us that Charlemagne later claimed he would not have entered the church that day had he known what the Pope intended, that he was caught off guard, that he was not entirely pleased. Historians have puzzled over this claim for centuries. Was he telling the truth? Was this diplomatic modesty a way of managing the reaction of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, who was decidedly unamused by the sudden appearance of a rival claimant to the Roman imperial title in the West? Was it genuine surprise from a man who, despite everything, had not quite envisioned himself in those terms? Or was it something more subtle, a carefully constructed piece of political theatre in which Charlemagne wished to appear chosen rather than grasping, an emperor who received his crown from God through the medium of the Pope rather than one who had simply decided to take it for himself? We cannot know, not really. The past keeps its secrets, as we have said, but the ambiguity itself tells us something. It tells us that the coronation was charged with meaning, layered with implication, in ways that everyone present could feel, but perhaps no one could fully articulate. What happened that Christmas morning in St. Peter's Basilica sent ripples forward through time in several distinct directions. The first was the idea of the Western Emperor itself. The title did not die with Charlemagne. It persisted, passed on and fought over, and eventually institutionalized into what historians call the Holy Roman Empire, that long, complicated, remarkable political entity that would endure in various forms until Napoleon dissolved it in 1806. 1,000 years, give or take, of an institution that traced its legitimacy in an unbroken conceptual line, back to that Christmas morning in Rome. The second ripple was the relationship between the papacy and secular power. What Leo III had done, placing a crown on a king's head, making himself the instrument of imperial legitimacy, established a precedent. It suggested that the Pope had the authority to make emperors. That sacred power could confer worldly power, that the Church stood, in some sense, above the throne. This idea would cause enormous trouble in the centuries to come. The investiture controversy, the walk to Canossa, emperors and popes circling each other across generations, each insisting on their own supremacy. The seeds of all of it were planted quietly in that lamplit basilica on a winter morning in 800. The third ripple was perhaps the most personal, and in some ways the most enduring. Charlemagne became, in the imagination of medieval Europe, something very close to a legend. The ideal Christian king, the warrior who had expanded the faith, the scholar who had renewed learning, the ruler who had brought a kind of order to the chaos that followed Rome's fall. Later, medieval writers would romanticize him extravagantly. The great cycle of chansons de geste, epic poems of adventure and chivalry, placed him and his legendary paladins at their center. The Song of Roland, perhaps the most famous of them, reimagines one of his actual campaigns in Spain as a great heroic tale of loyalty and sacrifice and holy war. Both France and Germany, nations that did not yet exist in. Charlemagne's time would later claim him as the father of their national identity. He is, in some symbolic sense, the ancestor of both, precisely because his empire eventually broke apart along lines that would, much later, become recognizable national borders. In the city of Aachen, his capital, his favorite residence, the place where he built his palace and his chapel, and where he is buried to this day, calls him simply Karl the Grocer, Karl the Great. The chapel still stands, octagonal, beautifully proportioned, consecrated in 805. If you visit it today, you can stand in the space where Charlemagne himself once stood for Mass and look up at the same geometry of stone arches rising above you. 12 centuries of presence in a single room. It is worth pausing here in the quiet to hold one thought before we move on. Charlemagne's empire did not last. Within a generation of his death in 814, his sons were at war with each other over the inheritance. By 843, the Treaty of Verdun had divided the empire into 3 broad portions: a western kingdom that would become France, an eastern kingdom that would become Germany, and a middle strip that would be fought over for centuries. The neat, powerful unity of the Carolingian realm crumbled back into the fractured complexity that was the natural condition of medieval Europe. But the idea lasted. The idea that there should be a single Christian empire in the West, guided by the Church, ordered by law, stretching across the old Roman lands, that idea proved impossibly durable. Emperors and popes and kings and scholars would invoke Charlemagne for centuries, each claiming some portion of his legacy, each arguing that they and not their rivals were the true heirs to what had been created that Christmas morning. We are, in some ways, still having versions of that argument today. The basilica in Rome, where it happened, was torn down in the 16th century to make way for the great new St. Peter's that stands there now. The exact spot where Charlemagne knelt is somewhere beneath the nave of the current building, underground, gone. But the crown, or at least the concept of the crown, lingered for a very long time, and the world it helped to shape, the world of popes and emperors, of Latin Christendom stretching from the Atlantic to the edges of the East, of kingdoms and feudal bonds and cathedral schools and all the texture of the medieval world we are exploring tonight. That world was made possible in no small part by what one pope did on one winter morning when a great king knelt in prayer and did not perhaps see what was coming. Let that image settle. A kneeling king, a crown descending, a congregation crying out in the lamplight. And then, if you are comfortable, if your breath is slow and easy, let it drift away. We will move, when you are ready, to the next story. Further still into the medieval world. There is no hurry. The history has already happened. It will wait for you. Chapter 3. Æthelred, the Unready, and the Undone, Danish Conquest. We have been moving through time slowly, as one does in the quiet hours. We visited a field in Francia, where a battle was won in autumn light. We visited a basilica in Rome, where a crown descended on a kneeling king. Now we travel northwest, across the old Frankish lands, across the channel of water the English would one day call simply the Narrow Sea, and onto a large green island at the edge of the known world, Britain, England, as it was beginning to be called, a kingdom still young enough to remember when it had not quite been a kingdom at all, when it had been a collection of rival Anglo-Saxon realms, each with its own king, its own customs, its own particular way of ordering the world. It had been, in the 9th century, a great king named Alfred the Great of Wessex, who had done most to hold those pieces together against the pressure of Viking raids and Viking settlement. And it had been Alfred's descendants who had, over the generations that followed, extended their authority across more and more of the island, until something that could genuinely be called the Kingdom of England began to take shape. By the year 1013, that kingdom was in serious trouble. First, let us spend a moment with the man whose name has followed him through history with an unfortunate kind of comedy. Æthelred, King of England since 978, when he had come to the throne as a young boy under circumstances that were, from the very beginning, shadowed. His older brother, King Edward, had been murdered, almost certainly with the knowledge, if not the direct involvement, of those around Æthelred. The boy king began his reign under a cloud of suspicion that he had done nothing to invite but could never quite escape. The nickname by which history knows him, the Unready, is a translation, but not quite an accurate one. The Old English word was unread, and read in Old English meant counsel, advice, wisdom, the considered judgment of a king who listens to good advisors and acts wisely upon what he hears. Unread meant, roughly, poorly counseled. Without good advice, a king who either could not find wise counsel or would not take it when it was offered. There is also, and scholars have enjoyed pointing this out for generations, a pun embedded in the nickname, because Æthelred itself means noble counsel, noble advice, and so the full joke, if you want to call it that, is Æthelred, the noble counsel, the poorly counselled, a name that promises wisdom, and a nickname that suggests its absence. History can be rather unkind. The England that Æthelred ruled was wealthy. That was, in a sense, part of its problem. The Vikings, and we should be careful here, because Viking is a broad word for a complicated and varied collection of Scandinavian peoples with different origins and different ambitions, had known about England's wealth for a long time. Since the late 8th century, Norse raiders had been striking the coastlines, attacking monasteries, taking silver and slaves, and disappearing back to sea. By Æthelred's time, the raids had grown in scale and organization. These were not small bands of opportunists. These were large professional armies, led by experienced commanders, equipped and supplied for extended campaigns. And Æthelred's response to them had been, over the years, inconsistent. At times he had fought, at times he had paid. The payments, enormous sums of silver extracted from his own people through a tax called the Danegeld, had brought temporary peace, but also signaled something troubling. They told the Danes that England would pay, that the well was deep and could be drawn from again, that persistence would be rewarded. One of Æthelred's most notorious decisions came in 1002, when he ordered the killing of all Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November. The massacre was real, though its scale and reach are debated by historians. What is certain is that among those killed was a woman named Gunhilda, who may have been a sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Whether that personal connection was the cause or simply a convenient justification, what followed was a systematic and increasingly devastating series of campaigns by Sweyn against England, campaigns of punishment, of plunder, and ultimately of conquest. Sweyn Forkbeard is worth a moment of attention in himself. He was, by any measure, a formidable figure, King of Denmark, and through a complicated web of Scandinavian politics, effectively dominant over much of Norway as well. He was an experienced military commander who had spent decades navigating the violent, shifting landscape of Northern European power. The name Forkbeard refers, presumably, to a distinctive style of beard, bifurcated, forked, though we cannot be entirely certain. History preserves the nickname, but not the face. By the summer of 1013, Sweyn had decided that raiding England was no longer the objective. Conquest was. He landed with his fleet on the eastern coast in the north of England and moved with a speed and precision that suggests careful prior planning. The north submitted quickly. The Danelaw, the old Viking-settled areas of northern and eastern England, had cultural and family connections to Scandinavia that made submission less of a rupture than it might have been elsewhere. The 5 boroughs, the Northumbrians. One after another, the great figures of the north came to Sweyn and offered hostages and acknowledged him as king. Then he turned south. Oxford surrendered, Winchester surrendered. London held out for a time. Æthelred was there, and the city's defences were strong. But Sweyn moved around it, continued south and west, and the rest of England fell away. The kingdom unravelled with a speed that must have been dizzying to those who lived through it. By the end of 1013, it was over. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that remarkable and invaluable record of English history kept by monks in various monasteries across the country, records the moment with bleak brevity. The whole nation, it says, regarded Sweyn as full king, and Æthelred was gone. He had sent his wife Emma, a Norman noblewoman, daughter of the Duke of Normandy, and his sons ahead of him across the Channel. And then, when there was nothing left to hold, he followed. He crossed the sea to Normandy, to the court of his brother-in-law, and became something no English king had been before, an exile. Imagine that for a moment. in the quiet of the night. A king sitting in a foreign court, across the water from his own kingdom. His throne occupied by another man, his people paying their taxes to a Danish conqueror. The kingdom his ancestors had built over generations. The kingdom of Alfred, of Athelstan, of Edgar the Peaceful, seemingly gone, absorbed, overwritten. History in that December of 1013 appeared to have made its decision. England was Danish now. And then, in February of 1014, Sweyn Forkbeard died. The death was sudden. He had been at Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, organising his new kingdom, when he fell ill. Or, in the more dramatic versions of events that circulated later, was struck down in a vision by the ghost of Saint Edmund, the martyred English king, whose body rested at Bury St. Edmunds, and who was said to have appeared to Sweyn in the night, furious at the Danish king's threats against his shrine. History is agnostic on the question of ghostly interventions. What is not in doubt is the practical result. Sweyn was dead. His son Cnut, young, newly arrived in England, not yet the powerful and capable king he would eventually become, suddenly found himself holding a claim to a kingdom that had not yet been fully secured, with an army that needed paying and magnates whose loyalties were still uncertain. England held its breath. What happened next is one of the most quietly remarkable episodes in the entire sweep of English history. And it is remarkable not for battles or coronations or dramatic confrontations, but for something much more unusual in the medieval world. A negotiation. The great men of England, the earls, the senior clergy, the councillors, the figures who between them held the real substance of power across the kingdom, sent messengers to Æthelred in Normandy. And the messages they sent were, in their way, extraordinary. They said, "Come back. We want our king to return." But, and here is the remarkable part, they attached conditions. They said that every Danish king had been more hostile to them than any other, and that nothing in the world was dearer to them than their natural lord, if he would only govern them more justly than he had before. They asked that he renounce the things that had been said and done against him. They asked that all the things that had been said and done against him be forgiven. They asked, in short, for better government, for a king who would listen, for Red, in the full sense of that old English word, for counsel and wisdom and just rule. Æthelred, for his part, responded. He sent his own messengers, including his son Edward, the boy who would one day be called the Confessor, back to England with his reply. He promised that he would be a gracious lord to them, that he would reform everything they hated, that all the things said or done against him would be forgiven, on the condition that they all turned to him loyally and without treachery. Back and forth, the messages went. Promises were exchanged. Terms were agreed. And then the councillors of England and the king, who had fled it, swore oaths to one another. New laws were declared. Old grievances were set aside, at least in principle. And Æthelred came home. What he came home to was a kingdom still in the process of deciding what it was going to be. Cnut had not given up. He was still in England, still with his fleet, still with an army. But he was in a weaker position than he had been, and he knew it. When Æthelred moved against him, marching north into Lincolnshire, into the area called Lindsey, where Nut had wintered and where many of the local people had already given him their support, Cnut withdrew. He could not hold what his father had won. Not yet. he sailed away. And as he went, in a gesture that tells you something about the nature of Viking warfare and Viking pragmatism, he put ashore the hostages that the English had given his father as pledges of submission, but not before having their hands and ears and noses cut off. A message, a promise of return, a reminder that the matter was not closed. And then he was gone, across the North Sea, back to Denmark, to consolidate his position and plan for the future. England was, for the moment, English again. The exchange of promises in 1014, Æthelred's conditional return, the terms agreed, between king and councillors, has attracted considerable interest from historians, particularly those interested in the history of constitutional government, because what happened there was unusual. The king had made explicit commitments to rule justly. He had accepted, at least in principle, that his right to rule was connected to his fulfillment of obligations. That kingship was not simply a matter of hereditary right, to be exercised however the king saw fit, but something more like a contract, a relationship between a ruler and the ruled that carried expectations on both sides. This is, of course, a very long way from Magna Carta, which would come 2 centuries later, and a much longer way still from any modern understanding of constitutional government. We should be careful not to read too much forward into a moment that was, in its own context, primarily practical and personal rather than ideological. The English magnates wanted their familiar king back because the alternative was uncertainty and a Danish ruler they did not know. They were not writing political philosophy, and yet the moment is there. The precedent, however small, is there. A king who came back on conditions. A kingdom that said, in effect, you may be our lord, but there are terms. Æthelred would reign for another 2 years, dying in April 1016, with the Danish problem still unresolved and Knut already returned to press his claim once more. The peace of 1014 was real, but fragile. The country his son Edmund Ironside inherited was already at war again, and Knut, in the end, did become King of England. By 1016, after Edmund's death, he had it all: England, Denmark, and eventually Norway too. The Danish conquest that had seemed to be undone in 1014 was completed, in the end, just 2 years later. History, as it does, found a way. But those 2 years matter. The interlude matters, not because it permanently changed the outcome. It didn't. But because of what it revealed. Revealed that a seemingly completed conquest could be unmade by a single death, that the ties between a people and their traditional king ran deep enough to pull a man back from exile, that even in the brutal, uncertain world of the early 11th century, there was space, small, fragile, easily closed, for something like negotiation, for something like a conversation between a king and his kingdom about the terms of their life together. That conversation, conducted in messages carried across the Channel in the winter of 1014, is easy to overlook beside the grander dramas of the Norman conquest that would come half a century later. But it is there, in the record, quiet and significant. A king in exile, a kingdom making terms, the brief, strange unraveling of a conquest that had seemed complete. England would be fought over many more times before the medieval period ended. The island at the edge of the world had a way of drawing people to it, Danes and Normans and others, who sensed in its green fields and its accumulated wealth something worth the risk of crossing cold and difficult water. But on a winter morning in 1014, When Æthelred stepped back onto English soil after his exile and the Danish forces withdrew from Lindsey into the Grey Sea, the kingdom was, for a moment, itself again. Hold that image gently, a king coming home across cold water, a kingdom briefly breathing out. And then, when you are ready, let it go. We will move on to the next story. Deeper into the medieval world, further into the quiet past, there is no hurry. The history has already happened. It will wait for you. Chapter 4. The Great Schism. We have been tracing, without quite meaning to, a kind of thread. In our first story, Charles Martel held the line at Tours, and the world north of the Pyrenees remained, broadly speaking, a Latin Christian world. In our second, Charlemagne was crowned in Rome, and the papacy bound itself to the fate of Western kingdoms in ways that would echo for centuries. In our third, a kingdom at the edge of the world negotiated with its own king, feeling its way towards something fragile and new. All of these stories took place within a single Christian world, or at least a world that thought of itself that way, a world that shared, however imperfectly and however disputatiously, a common faith, a common set of sacred texts, a common sense that there was one church, however complicated and fractious and human the church might be in practice. Tonight's story is about the moment the single world cracked. Not suddenly. Nothing in history happens quite as suddenly as it seems, but definitively, formally, with the weight of official pronouncement and the bitter particular finality of two groups of men deciding that they had had enough of each other. The year is 1054, the place is Constantinople, and the story begins as so many ecclesiastical disputes do, not with theology, but with politics, and not with grand politics, but with something considerably more personal. To understand the schism, we have to understand that the Christian church had never been quite as unified as the word church might suggest. From its earliest centuries, Christianity had spread in multiple directions simultaneously, west into the Latin-speaking world of Rome and its territories, east into the Greek-speaking world of the Byzantine Empire, and further still into Syria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Persia, and beyond. Each of these branches had developed its own traditions, its own liturgical practices, its own theological emphases, its own way of ordering the relationship between bishops and patriarchs and the faithful. The great early councils, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, had tried to establish common ground, common doctrine, common authority, and they had succeeded, more or less, in hammering out the great shared statements of Christian belief that both East and West would carry forward. The nature of Christ, the Trinity, the relationship between the human and the divine. But even as those agreements were being reached, the differences were accumulating, quietly, gradually, the way water finds its way into stone, not dramatically, but persistently over time. There were differences of language, first of all. The West conducted its theology and its liturgy in Latin. The East conducted its in Greek. This sounds like a practical matter, and it was, but it was also more than that. Language shapes thought. The theological vocabulary of Latin Christianity and the theological vocabulary of Greek Christianity had developed in a parallel, and the words did not always map neatly onto each other. Concepts that seemed clear in one language became slippery, contested, potentially heretical when translated into the other. There were differences of practice. The Western Church required its clergy to be celibate. The Eastern Church allowed parish priests to marry, though bishops were required to be celibate. The West used unleavened bread in the Eucharist. The East used leavened bread. These might seem like small things, and in one sense they are. But in a world where the correct performance of sacred ritual was understood to be a matter of profound spiritual importance, they were anything but small. There were differences of authority, and this is where things became genuinely complicated. Rome had always claimed a special status among the great centers of Christianity. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, argued that his see had been founded by St. Peter himself, to whom Christ had said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." Peter in Rome had been martyred, and his successors, the popes, carried that apostolic authority forward. Constantinople saw things differently. The Eastern Church recognized the Bishop of Rome as holding a position of honor, a primacy of honor, as the phrase went, among the 5 great patriarchates of the ancient church. But honor was not the same as jurisdiction. It was not the same as supreme authority. The Patriarch of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Patriarch of Antioch, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, these were not subordinates of Rome. They were peers, brothers in faith, with their own authority in their own domains. Rome disagreed, had always, in some sense, disagreed. And over the centuries, as the Western Roman Empire fell and the Eastern Empire continued, as Latin Christendom and Byzantine Christianity developed along increasingly different lines, the disagreement had never quite been resolved. It had been managed, papered over, set aside when there were more pressing concerns. But it was always there, underneath the surface of Christian unity, like a fault line in apparently solid ground. By the middle of the 11th century, several things were happening at once that brought the fault line to the surface. The papacy was in the middle of a significant reform movement. A series of reforming popes and their allies were trying to purify the Western Church, to root out simony, the buying and selling of church offices, to reassert clerical celibacy, to free the papacy from the political interference of secular rulers, and, importantly, to clarify and strengthen the authority of Rome over the universal church. The reform movement was energetic, confident, and not inclined to tolerate what it saw as deviation from proper practice. In southern Italy, Latin and Greek Christianity had long coexisted in close and sometimes uncomfortable proximity. The region had been part of the Byzantine sphere of influence, and its churches followed Eastern practices. But now the papacy, under the reforming Pope Leo IX, was extending its influence southward, and Latin practices were being imposed on churches that had always done things differently. The Patriarch of Constantinople at this time was a man named Michael Cerularius. He was proud, assertive, deeply convinced of the dignity and independence of his see, and not disposed to accept what he saw as Roman overreach without response. When he heard about the imposition of Latin practices in southern Italy, he struck back. He closed the Latin Rite churches in Constantinople. He wrote letters denouncing Western practices, the unleavened bread, the clerical celibacy requirements, as innovations, as departures from authentic tradition. Two proud institutions, each convinced of its own rightness, had found each other's most sensitive points and begun to press on them. Pope Leo IX, meanwhile, was having a difficult year. He had led a military campaign against the Normans in southern Italy The papacy was, in this period, also a temporal power with lands and armies, and had been comprehensively defeated, captured, and was essentially being held in honourable but real captivity at Benevento. He was also, it would emerge, seriously ill. He would die in April 1054, but before he died, he sent legates to Constantinople, ambassadors of the papal court charged with negotiating with Michael Cerularius and, if necessary, making Rome's position unmistakably clear. The chief legate was a man named Humbert of Silva Candida, Cardinal Humbert, a senior figure in the reform movement, a man of considerable learning and considerable inflexibility. He was not by temperament a diplomat. He was a man who believed deeply in the rightness of his position and had limited patience for those who saw things differently. The meeting between Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Cerularius went badly almost from the beginning. The details of the months of negotiation and argument that followed are intricate and, in the small hours of the night, probably not what the moment calls for. What matters is the accumulation, the growing mutual incomprehension, the hardening of positions, the sense on both sides that the other was not simply wrong, but obstinate, willfully, almost perversely, wrong. On the 16th of July, 1054, a Saturday, the day before the great celebration of the Sunday liturgy, Cardinal Humbert entered the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, one of the great buildings of the ancient world, its vast dome seeming to float above the gathered faithful, its mosaics gleaming in the light that fell through a ring of windows at the dome's base. A building designed to make you feel the presence of something larger than yourself. Humbert walked to the high altar and placed upon it a document, a bull of excommunication directed at Michael Cerularius personally and condemning him and his associates in terms of considerable venom. The document accused Cerularius of a long list of errors and heresies, some of which were genuinely disputed theological points, and some of which were, frankly, incorrect. The product of misunderstanding and the kind of polemical excess that comes from arguing at close quarters with someone you have come deeply to dislike. Then Humbert turned and walked out. According to later accounts, he shook the dust from his feet as he left, a biblical gesture of final repudiation. The deacon ran after him, begging him to take the document back. Humbert refused. Cerularius's response was not long in coming. He convened a council. The bull of excommunication was condemned, and in turn, Humbert and his fellow legates were themselves excommunicated. It is worth noting, with the precision that history requires, that the excommunications were technically personal rather than institutional. Humbert excommunicated Cerularius. Cerularius's council excommunicated Humbert. Pope Leo IX had already died by the time Humbert arrived in Constantinople, which meant, by strict canonical reasoning, that the legate's authority to act in his name was at least questionable. The new pope had not yet been properly elected. Historians have sometimes pointed to these technicalities and suggested that the schism of 1054 was, in formal terms, less definitive than it is usually presented, that it was one bad episode in a long series of bad episodes rather than a clean final break. There is something to this. The churches continued to have contact. There were ongoing attempts at reconciliation over the following decades and centuries. The full psychological weight of permanent, irrevocable separation took time to settle into the consciousness of both sides. And yet, the document was placed, the gesture was made, the dust was shaken from the feet, and in the years that followed, the separation hardened into something that felt and functioned as permanent. The consequences spread outward through time in ways that neither Humbert nor Cerularius could have anticipated, standing in that golden church on a July Saturday. The Crusades, which began in 1095, not very far in the future from where we are standing, were shaped by the schism in ways both obvious and subtle. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade, he was calling the Latin Christian West to a common purpose. The Eastern Christians were, in theory, to be aided. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios had asked for Western military help against the Seljuk Turks, but the relationship between the crusading armies and the Byzantine world they passed through was complicated, suspicious, and often openly hostile. The two branches of Christianity looked at each other and did not quite see brothers. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the situation reached its lowest point. A crusading army, diverted from its original purpose, sacked Constantinople, the great Christian city, the city of Hagia Sophia, pillaging its churches and treasuries, breaking open its reliquaries, carting off its treasures to Venice and the courts of Western nobles. It was a wound from which Byzantine trust in the Latin West never fully recovered. Further east, the consequences of the schism shaped the development of entirely new civilizations. When the people of Kievan Rus, the great Slavic realm centered on what is now Ukraine, were converted to Christianity in the late 10th century, they were converted by missionaries from the Byzantine world. They received Eastern Christianity with its Greek liturgy, its icons, its traditions, its relationship to Constantinople. The schism meant that this world, which would eventually give rise to Russia, to the Russian Orthodox Church, to a whole civilization of extraordinary richness and complexity, developed along a different axis from Latin Christendom. Moscow would eventually style itself the Third Rome, the true heir of Christian imperial authority. After Rome itself and then Constantinople, the Russian Orthodox Church would carry forward the traditions of Byzantine Christianity through centuries in which the Byzantine Empire itself had fallen, preserving something that might otherwise have been lost entirely. In the Balkans, the schism drew a line, not always a clean one, not always a stable one, but a real one, between the worlds of Latin and Orthodox Christianity. Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece on one side, Croatia, Slovenia, and the lands further west on the other. That line, traced in the 11th century, can still be felt today, in politics and culture and identity, in ways that would take many more hours than we have tonight to fully explore. And in the West, the schism clarified something important about the papacy's vision of itself. Rome was the center. Rome's authority was universal. Rome would not share that authority with Constantinople or with anyone else. The reforming popes of the 11th century and their successors took that position and built upon it decade by decade until the medieval papacy reached the extraordinary height of its power and confidence in the 12th and 13th centuries. A confidence made possible in part by the removal of a rival claimant to universal Christian authority. Two churches, each convinced it was the true one, each carrying forward something real and ancient and valuable from the earliest centuries of the faith, each looking at the other across the centuries that followed with a mixture of recognition and estrangement that is perhaps the most painful kind of distance, the distance between those who were once close. The excommunications of 1054 were formally lifted in 1964. Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras met in Jerusalem, the first meeting between a pope and an ecumenical patriarch in 500 years, and together they revoked the mutual condemnations of that July Saturday 9 centuries before. It was a gesture of great symbolic weight and great genuine warmth. The churches remain separate. The theological and ecclesiological questions that divided them in 1054 have not been resolved, and the centuries of divergent development have added further layers of difference that a single meeting, however warm, cannot simply dissolve. But the gesture was made. A door, long closed, opened a fraction, and in Hagia Sophia, which is now a mosque, having been converted after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, and which has had its own complex history in the centuries since. The mosaics are still there, some of them at least. The great golden faces of Christ and the Virgin looking down from the walls with the patient stillness of images that have watched 11 centuries of human argument and human longing pass beneath them. They were there when Humber walked in with his document. They are there still. Let that image rest in the mind for a moment. A great golden dome, mosaics in the lamplight, two branches of a single ancient faith pulling slowly, irreversibly apart. And somewhere in the centuries that followed, the shape of the world we live in now, with its distinct Eastern and Western Christian traditions, its Russian and Greek and Serbian and Romanian Orthodox churches, its Roman Catholic Church, its long, complex history of encounter and estrangement, emerging from that one July afternoon. History is patient. It works slowly. It works in documents placed on altars and gestures of dust shaken from feet, and the long accumulation of small differences that over time become large ones. Let it be still now. Let the golden light of that distant church fade gently. We will move on, when you are ready, to the next story. The history has already happened. It will wait for you. Chapter 5. The Battle of Manzikert. We left our last story in Constantinople, in the golden interior of Hagia Sophia, with its mosaics and its lamplight, and the slow, sorrowful divergence of two branches of a single faith. We watched the Christian world crack along a line that had been forming for centuries, and we felt the weight of what that crack would eventually mean. For Russia, for the Balkans, for the shape of religious identity across half the world. We stay in the East now for this next story. We stay with Byzantium, the great empire that had continued where Rome left off, that had kept the flame of late Roman civilization burning through the centuries when the western half of the empire had fallen dark, the empire of Constantinople, of Greek language and Roman law, of magnificent churches and complex bureaucracy, and a tradition of scholarship and administration that stretched back in an unbroken line to the ancient world. By 1071, that empire was about to face the worst military catastrophe in centuries, a defeat so complete, so consequential, that its effects would ripple outward through generations, into the Crusades, into the eventual fall of Constantinople itself, into the very shape of the modern Middle East. It happened in a place called Manzikert, on a hot August day, on the high plateau of eastern Anatolia, and it began, as many disasters do, with a series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. To understand Manzikert, we need to understand the world the Byzantine Empire inhabited in the middle of the 11th century. And that world was one of considerable pressure. From the west, there were the Normans, those restless descendants of Viking settlers in northern France, who had by this period established themselves in southern Italy and were pressing hard against Byzantine territories there. We have already met the Normans briefly in the context of Pope Leo IX's disastrous military campaign against them. They were formidable opponents, and the Byzantine Empire's western flank was under real strain. From the east, there was a new and rapidly expanding power, the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a Turkic people from the Central Asian steppes who had converted to Sunni Islam and, in the decades before 1071, had built an empire of remarkable speed and scope. They had taken Baghdad in 1055, where the Abbasid Caliph had granted their leader the title of Sultan, a recognition of temporal power, while the Caliph retained his spiritual authority. They had pushed westward into Armenia, into the borderlands between the Byzantine world and the Islamic world, raiding, settling, testing the edges of Byzantine power. The raids into Anatolia, the great peninsula that forms the heartland of what is now Turkey, had been growing in frequency and depth. Byzantine border defences, which had been strong in earlier generations, had been weakened by political instability, by the kind of court intrigue and succession crisis that the Byzantine system was particularly prone to generating. In the decade before Manzikert, there had been 6 different emperors in Constantinople, 6 in 10 years. Each change of ruler brought disruption, redistribution of resources, the settling of political scores. It was not a system in good health. The emperor who led the Byzantine army to Manzikert was Romanos, the 4th Diogenes. He had come to the throne in 1068 through marriage to the widowed empress rather than through any dynastic right of his own. Already a complicated foundation for authority. He was a capable military commander, energetic and personally brave, and he understood that the eastern frontier needed attention. He had campaigned there in previous years with some success, trying to shore up the defences and push back against the Seljuk incursions. In 1071, he mounted a major expedition, a large army. The sources vary on the numbers, as they always do for medieval armies, and the truth is probably somewhere between the most conservative and most dramatic estimates. Moved east from Constantinople, across Anatolia, toward the frontier. The campaign did not go smoothly from the beginning. There were supply problems. There were command tensions. The Byzantine army of this period was a complicated thing, a mixture of professional soldiers, provincial levies, and crucially, a large number of mercenaries from various backgrounds, including Normans, Varangians, Pechenegs, and others. Holding such a force together, keeping its loyalties aligned, was a constant challenge. And somewhere in the complexity of the campaign planning, a decision was made that would prove catastrophic. The 2 armies found each other near the fortress town of Manzikert, in what is now eastern Turkey, not far from Lake Van. The Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, was present in person. He was, by most accounts, a gifted military commander. The name Alp Arslan means, in Turkic, heroic lion, and it was a name he had done something to earn. What exactly happened in the battle on the 26th of August, 1071, is, like all medieval battles, partly obscured by the limits of our sources. But the broad shape of events is clear enough. Romanos had divided his forces. Part of the army was sent off on a separate operation, and crucially, that detachment included many of the most reliable troops. The force that remained with Romanos was large, but of uneven quality and uncertain cohesion. The battle began in the late afternoon. The Byzantine forces advanced. The Seljuk cavalry, using the classic nomadic tactics of the Central Asian steppe tradition, feigned retreats, fluid movement, hit-and-run strikes, drew them forward, stretched them, broke their formations. The Byzantine line began to fragment. And then, as evening came and Romanos ordered a retreat, a maneuver that, in the chaos of a fragmenting battle, is one of the most dangerous things an army can attempt. Things fell apart entirely. Some of the commanders interpreted the retreat order as a rout and began to withdraw in earnest. Others believed, or claimed to believe, that Romanos himself had been killed and pulled their forces back. There is also the shadow of treachery over the whole affair. One of the Byzantine commanders, a man named Andronikos Doukas, may have deliberately spread the rumor that Romanos was dead in order to hasten the army's collapse, for reasons connected to the bitter politics of the Byzantine court, where the Doukas family was a rival to Romanos's power. In the confusion, the emperor found himself surrounded. He fought, by all accounts, with genuine courage, personally engaged in the close fighting, refusing to flee. He was wounded, and then he was captured. The Byzantine emperor, taken prisoner on the battlefield by the Seljuk Sultan. Alp Arslan's treatment of his captive is one of the more surprising moments in the story. There is an account, repeated in various sources, though we should hold it with the gentle skepticism we give to all such vivid historical anecdotes, of the meeting between the Sultan and his imperial prisoner. Romanos was brought before Alp Arslan, and the Sultan asked him what he would have done had their positions been reversed. Romanos reportedly said, "I would probably have killed you or paraded you through the streets of Constantinople." Alp Arslan, it is said, smiled. He would do neither. He treated Romanos with honor. He negotiated a ransom and a peace treaty, relatively favorable terms by the standards of medieval warfare, and released him. Whether the scene happened precisely as described, we cannot say, but the terms of the treaty were real, and the release was real. Romanos began the long journey back to Constantinople. He never made it home safely. In his absence, the court politics had moved decisively against him. The Doukas family had seized power. When Romanos returned to Byzantine territory, he was deposed, blinded, in the Byzantine fashion, and sent to a monastery on a small island. He died of his wounds, or of the treatment of them, within months. The peace treaty he had negotiated with Alp Arslan died with his authority. And now the consequences began to unfold, slowly at first, and then with gathering unstoppable momentum. With no treaty in force and the Byzantine military power in the east shattered, the Seljuk Turks began to move into Anatolia. Not as a single organized conquest, the Seljuk realm was itself complex and not always unified, but as a gradual, decentralized process of settlement and infiltration. Turkish clans and warriors moved onto the Anatolian plateau, occupying land that had been Byzantine for centuries, in many cases for longer than the Byzantine Empire itself had existed. This was land that had been Greek-speaking, Christian, the heartland of the empire's agricultural wealth and military manpower. Over the following decades, the Byzantines lost most of Anatolia, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but city by city, valley by valley. The interior of the peninsula passed out of their control. The great urban centers of the Aegean coast and the northwest held on longer, but the interior was gone. The empire that remained was a coastal, maritime empire, strong along the sea lanes, connected to its island territories, but lacking the deep territorial base that had always been its foundation. It would survive in various forms for nearly 4 more centuries after Manzikert, but it would never recover the wholeness, the confident territorial depth of what it had been before. The appeal to the West came a generation later. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, a capable ruler who had done much to stabilize what remained of Byzantine power, sent an embassy to Pope Urban II in 1095. He needed military help. He needed soldiers. He needed the West to understand that the Christian East was under terrible pressure, that the holy places of the faith, Jerusalem, Antioch, the great sites of Christian memory, were in the hands of Muslim rulers, and that something needed to be done. Urban II heard the appeal, and at the Council of Clermont in November 1095, he preached the sermon that launched the First Crusade. The connection between Manzikert in 1071 and Clermont in 1095 is not simple or direct. The crusading movement had multiple causes. The Reformed papacy's desire to lead Christendom in a great common enterprise, the religious enthusiasm of Western knights and pilgrims, the complex internal politics of both the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Manzikert was not the only cause, or even the primary cause, of the Crusades, but it was a necessary condition. Without the loss of Anatolia, without the weakening of Byzantine power, without the pressure on Constantinople that Manzikert had made possible, Alexios would have had no reason to appeal to the West, and Urban might never have had the particular combination of circumstances that made his Clermont sermon so explosively effective. The battle on the High Plateau in August 1071 set in motion a chain of events that would bring crusading armies marching through Anatolia on their way to Jerusalem, armies that the Byzantines had asked for, and that would prove, as we have already touched on, far more ambivalent a gift than Alexios had hoped. There is something worth holding on to in the quiet of this hour about the nature of what happened at Manzikert. It was not the end of the Byzantine Empire. That is a common misconception. The 1071 was a kind of fatal blow, after which the empire was simply dying. It was not. The Komnenian dynasty that came to power in the years after Manzikert produced some of the most capable rulers in Byzantine history. The empire adapted, reconsolidated, reformed its military, and continued for centuries. But something was lost at Manzikert that could not be fully recovered. Not just territory, though the territorial loss was enormous. Something more like possibility. The confident, expansive sense that the Byzantine Empire could hold what it had always held, that Anatolia was securely Roman in the way that it had been Roman since the time of Constantine. That confidence was broken on the plateau above Lake Van in the long, hot afternoon of an August battle. and the world that came after, the crusading world, the world of the slow Byzantine retreat, the world that would eventually see Constantinople itself fall in 1453, was shaped, in no small part, by that single afternoon. Alp Arslan, who treated his captive emperor with something like chivalry and then watched his ransom agreement dissolve when Byzantine politics consumed the man he had released, died the following year, killed in a separate campaign by a prisoner who lunged at him before the Sultan's guards could intervene. He had been, by most accounts, a remarkable leader. His empire did not long survive him in the form he had built it. The Seljuk realm fragmented, as great steppe empires tended to do. But the movement of peoples, his victories, had accelerated. The Turkish settlement of Anatolia continued long after him, outlasted the Seljuk state itself, and eventually produced the Ottoman Empire, which would stand for 6 centuries, and which would, in 1453, finally take Constantinople and end the last remnant of the Roman world. All of that, in some distant but real sense, flowing from one afternoon on the Eastern Plateau. The high plateau of Eastern Turkey is still there, of course, vast and open, with the clean air and the wide skies of elevated country. Lake Van still gleams in the same light it always has, deep blue against the volcanic mountains that surround it. The fortress town of Manzikert is now a small place called Malazgirt, quiet and largely unremarkable. There is a monument there now to the Battle of Manzikert, celebrated in modern Turkey as a founding moment, the opening of Anatolia to the Turkic peoples who would eventually make it their home. History looks different depending on where you are standing. That is perhaps one of the most important things that history teaches us, if we let it. The same afternoon, the same plateau, the same dust and heat, and the cries of a fragmenting army. A catastrophe from one direction, a beginning from another. Let that thought sit quietly. Let the plateau be still. We are halfway through our journey now. 5 stories told, 5 still to come. Rest a moment, if you like. Let the images settle. The autumn field, the lamplit basilica, the cold channel crossing, the golden dome, the high plateau in August light. And when you are ready, we will continue. The history has already happened. It will wait for you. Chapter 6. The First Crusade. Called. We have been building toward this story for a while now. In our 4th segment, we watched the Christian world divide, East from West, Greek from Latin, Constantinople from Rome, in the lamplit interior of Hagia Sophia. In our 5th, we watched the Byzantine Empire absorb a blow on the high plateau of eastern Anatolia that it would never fully recover from, and we heard, at the end of that story, the name of a council, a city in France, a pope with a sermon, Clermont, Urban II, 1095. We arrive there now, and what we find when we arrive is something that surprised almost everyone who witnessed it. Something that surprised, in all probability, the man who set it in motion. Because Pope Urban II, when he stood before the assembled clergy and nobility at Clermont in November of 1095 and called for an armed pilgrimage to the east, was making a calculated political move, a sophisticated piece of papal strategy carefully considered, shaped by the particular pressures and ambitions of the reforming papacy. What he got was something far larger, far stranger, far more consequential than any calculation could have produced. What he got was a movement. To understand what Urban was trying to do, we need to spend a moment with the world he inhabited. The reforming papacy of the late 11th century was engaged in a great struggle. The investiture controversy, the battle over who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots, the question of whether secular rulers could exercise authority over the church's own appointments. It was a dispute of enormous practical importance because bishops and abbots controlled vast wealth and lands, and whoever controlled the appointments controlled, in a very real sense, much of the political fabric of medieval Europe. The papacy had been fighting this battle against the Holy Roman Emperors for decades. It was exhausting, complicated, and had left the Christian West in a state of tension and disunity that troubled thinking churchmen deeply. Urban saw in the appeal from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios an opportunity to lead, to unite the fractious nobles and knights of Western Europe behind a common purpose that the papacy could direct, to channel the considerable violence of medieval aristocratic culture, all those trained warriors with their swords and their horses and their restless energy, toward a goal that was both genuinely pious and politically useful, to demonstrate to everyone watching that the Pope was the true leader of Christendom. He also genuinely believed in what he was calling for. These were not purely cynical calculations. The Holy Land, Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the places where Christ had walked and suffered and risen, had deep meaning for Western Christians. And the idea that those places were in the hands of Muslim rulers, that Christian pilgrims faced difficulties in reaching them, was a source of real and sincere grief and anger. Urban wove all of these threads together, and he preached. We do not have the exact text of the sermon at Clermont. What we have are several accounts written afterward by people who were present or who spoke to those who were, and they differ in their details in ways that are entirely typical of eyewitness accounts of powerful moments. Memory reshapes what it holds. The accounts tell us what the sermon felt like, what it called for, what it produced, and they agree on the essentials. Urban spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians. He spoke of the Holy Land, of Jerusalem, of the sacred places that every Christian knew from Scripture and from prayer. He spoke of the duty of Christian knights, men trained in war, men whose violence was so often turned against their own neighbors and countrymen, to turn that violence outward toward a holy purpose. He promised that those who went, who took the cross, would receive an indulgence, a remission of the penances owed for their sins. The journey itself would be the penance. The pilgrimage and the fighting would be, in that formulation, a single sacred act. And the crowd responded with something that seems to have astonished even those who had gathered, expecting a significant speech. Deus lo vult, they cried. God wills it. God wills it. God wills it. The chant rose and spread, and in the weeks and months that followed, it spread further still, across Francia, across the Norman lands, across the Rhine into Germany, into England and Italy, and the reaches of Christian Europe. People sewed crosses of cloth onto their tunics and their cloaks. They called themselves Crucis Signati, those signed with the cross. Crusaders, in the word that history would eventually settle on. What followed was not one movement, but several, proceeding in parallel and in sequence, each with its own character. The first and most dramatic was what historians sometimes call the People's Crusade, a vast, largely unorganized wave of ordinary men and women and children who set out from the Rhine Valley in the spring of 1096, months before the organized noble armies were ready to march. They were led, to the extent that they were led at all, by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, a small, intense, reportedly rather unkempt figure who had been preaching the crusade with extraordinary effect, and who found himself at the head of a movement he could barely control. The People's Crusade was a catastrophe almost from the beginning. The great mass of pilgrims moving through the Rhineland turned their violence first not eastward, but against the Jewish communities of the Rhine Valley. The Rhineland massacres of 1096, one of the most appalling episodes of the entire crusading era, in which thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were killed by crusading mobs. A darkness at the very outset of the movement, a reminder that religious enthusiasm can be a terrible as well as a powerful force. The survivors of the People's Crusade reached Constantinople, where Alexios, who had asked for mercenary soldiers and received instead a vast hungry mob, arranged to ferry them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as quickly as possible. There, they were destroyed by the Seljuk Turks. Most were killed, a few escaped. Peter the Hermit, who had crossed back to Constantinople before the disaster, survived. The main crusading armies were a different matter. They departed in the autumn of 1096 in several separate contingents, each under the command of a great noble. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, quiet and deeply pious. His brother Baldwin, more ambitious and politically shrewd. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy, tall, powerfully built, extraordinarily capable as a military commander, and animated by ambitions that were, from the very beginning, as much personal as they were religious. Raymond of Toulouse, the oldest of the great lords, who had taken a vow never to return to his lands in the south of France, who understood the pilgrimage in terms of profound personal devotion. They converged on Constantinople through different routes and at different times, through the winter of 1096 and into 1097. Alexios received them with a mixture of relief and considerable wariness. These were powerful men with powerful armies, and the emperor had no illusions about the complexity of what he had set in motion. He extracted oaths from the crusading leaders, promises that any lands they captured, which had previously belonged to the Byzantine Empire, would be returned to Byzantine authority. Those oaths would become a source of bitter dispute almost immediately. The march through Anatolia was brutal. The high plateau that we visited in our last story. The landscape of Manzikert, of open skies and thin air and distances that stretched to the horizon in every direction, was the terrain the crusading armies had to cross in the summer heat of 1097. The Seljuk Turks harassed them constantly, using the same mobile cavalry tactics that had broken the Byzantine army a generation before. But the Crusaders, for all their difficulties, were not a broken force. They were heavily armed, disciplined in the manner of Western European warfare, and animated by a ferocious collective purpose. They took Nicaea, the first major Seljuk city, in June 1097. They fought the Great Battle of Dorylaeum, where they discovered both the terrifying effectiveness of Seljuk cavalry and their own capacity to endure and prevail when they held their formations. They marched south and east through the burning summer, losing horses and men to thirst and disease and skirmishes, but not stopping. At Antioch, they stalled. The great fortified city, one of the ancient patriarchates of the Christian world, a place of enormous symbolic importance, held out against them for 7.5 months through the bitter Anatolian winter. The besiegers became, in a sense, the besieged, as the relieving Seljuk army pressed them from outside while the city held against them from within. Men starved, men deserted, men died of disease and exposure. The great Norman Lord Bohemond, through a combination of negotiation with a disaffected guard inside the city and his own audacious military instincts, finally got the army inside the walls in June 1098, only for a massive Seljuk relief force to arrive days later and trap the Crusaders inside the city they had just taken. What followed was a siege in reverse. The Crusaders inside Antioch, surrounded, running short of food, seemingly on the verge of collapse. And then a priest named Peter Bartholomew reported a vision. The Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, was buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. It was found, or a suitably ancient iron lance head was found, in circumstances that were believed by many and doubted by others. But the effect on morale was immediate and electric. The Crusaders sallied out from the city in a desperate charge, carrying the lance at their head, and the Seljuk army, for reasons that are still debated, perhaps surprised, perhaps itself facing internal tensions, broke and fled. Antioch was theirs. Jerusalem itself was reached in June 1099, 3 years after the armies had left their homelands in Western Europe. 3 years of marching and sieging and starving and fighting and dying, of distances that would have seemed almost incomprehensible to the men and women who had cheered at Clermont. The city was held by this point by the Fatimid Caliphate, the Shia Muslim rulers of Egypt who had taken it from the Seljuks only the year before and who had their own complex relationship with the various powers of the region. The Crusaders besieged it for 5 weeks. They built siege towers, they fasted, they walked barefoot in procession around the city walls, in imitation of the Israelites at Jericho, while the defenders on the walls above jeered at them. On the 15th of July, 1099, the walls were breached. The Crusaders poured into the city. What followed is one of the most painful episodes of the entire Crusadan era, and we should not pass over it in the dark, soothing tones of a late-night history, as though it was simply another detail. The Crusaders massacred the inhabitants of Jerusalem, Muslim and Jewish residents, men, women, and children, with a thoroughness and ferocity that shocked even some contemporary observers. The sources describe blood in the streets, the Temple Mount running red, an orgy of killing that lasted through the day and into the night. The Crusaders then went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and wept. They prayed, they gave thanks. They believed with complete and untroubled sincerity that what they had done was holy. The distance between their experience of that moment and ours is one of the deepest abysses in history. We cannot cross it. We can only acknowledge it. The Crusader states that emerged from the conquest, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, were remarkable and strange creations. Small Latin Christian enclaves in a predominantly Muslim world, governed by Western nobles who had to learn, with varying degrees of success and willingness, to live alongside populations very different from what they had known at home. They lasted in various configurations for nearly 2 centuries. Jerusalem itself would fall to Saladin in 1187, which would prompt further crusades. The last Crusader outpost, the city of Acre, would fall in 1291. 200 years of Western European presence in the Levant, beginning with that breach in Jerusalem's walls on a July afternoon in 1099. The longer consequences of urban sermon at Clermont are so vast that any account of them must be of necessity partial. The Crusades reoriented Western European culture toward the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that had lasting effects on trade, on scholarship, on architecture, on the transmission of knowledge, the rediscovery of classical Greek texts, much of which had been preserved in Arabic translation, was accelerated by the contact between Western and Islamic intellectual culture that the Crusading era made possible. The pointed arch of Gothic cathedral architecture may owe something to Islamic architectural traditions encountered in the East. The spice trade and the silk trade that enriched medieval Italian cities like Venice and Genoa was shaped by the crusading presence in the Levant. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, were products of the crusading world, and they became political and military forces of enormous consequence in their own right, shaping the history of the Baltic, of Iberia, of the entire arc of the Christian-Muslim frontier. And in the Islamic world, the Crusades left a memory that has never fully faded. The Arabic word for crusader, salib, from the word for cross, carried through the centuries, and the image of Western armies in the Levant, of crusader castles still standing in Syria and Lebanon, of Jerusalem taken and held and eventually recovered, became part of a historical consciousness that shaped and continues to shape how the relationship between the Western world and the Islamic world is understood and felt. Urban II did not live to hear of the fall of Jerusalem. He died in late July 1099, just 2 weeks after the city was taken, before the news had time to reach Rome. He died, in some sense, not knowing that it had worked, not knowing that the armies he had set in motion at Clermont had reached their destination. The sermon he preached on a November day in 1095, the exact words of which we do not have, and can only partially reconstruct from the accounts of those who heard it, set in motion 2 centuries of holy war, reshaped the relationship between Christianity and Islam in ways that are still being felt today, and altered the political and cultural landscape of 3 continents. A sermon in a field outside a French city on a cold November day. Words carried outward on the breath of a crowd crying, "God wills it," rippling forward through time until they reached us here, in the quiet of this night, 1,000 years later. Let that settle. The field at Clermont, the crowd, the 3 words rising and spreading, and then the long, extraordinary, terrible, complicated thing that those words became. History is patient with us. It does not demand that we resolve its contradictions tonight. It only asks that we hold them gently, with honesty and with care. Rest now in the stillness. 4 more stories wait for us. 4 more moments from the medieval world, each with its own shape, its own weight, its own long shadow reaching forward. But not yet. Rest first. The history has already happened. It will wait for you. Chapter 7. Genghis Khan's Election. We turn now away from the world we've been inhabiting, away from the Mediterranean, away from the stone cities and the lamplit churches and the papal councils and the crusading armies marching through the heat of Anatolia, away from the particular texture of European and Byzantine history, with its inherited Roman frameworks, its arguments about ecclesiastical authority, its feudal hierarchies, and its cathedral schools. We turn east and north, out onto the steppe. The steppe is one of those landscapes that is very difficult to hold in the imagination if you have not seen it. It is not dramatic in the way that mountains are dramatic, or coastlines, or deserts with their sculptural dunes. It is dramatic in the way that the open ocean is dramatic, to sheer, unbroken scale, grass stretching to every horizon, sky enormous and unmediated, pressing down on a world without walls, wind almost constant, carrying the smell of distance. This landscape, running in a vast arc from Hungary in the west through Central Asia to the borders of China in the east, thousands upon thousands of miles of it, had shaped a particular kind of human life for thousands of years, a life of movement, of herds and horses and felt tents that could be packed and moved when the grazing was exhausted, of clans and tribes organized around kinship and loyalty and the shared necessities of survival in a beautiful and unforgiving world. It was from this landscape and from this way of life that there emerged in the late 12th and early 13th centuries a man who would build the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. His name, when he was born, was Temujin. The early life of Temujin is known to us primarily through a remarkable document called The Secret History of the Mongols, a text written shortly after his death, ostensibly for the eyes of the Mongol royal family alone, and therefore possessed of a candor and a vividness that official chronicles rarely manage. It is one of the great texts of world literature, though it is not always recognized as such, partly because it comes from a world that sits outside the usual canon of works that educated Westerners encounter. What it tells us about Temujin's early life is a story of almost unrelenting hardship. He was born, probably in the 1160s, into a clan of the Borjigan tribe. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of some local standing. When Temujin was around 9 years old, his father was poisoned by members of a rival tribe, the Tatars. While returning from delivering his son to the family of the girl, Temujin was to eventually marry. With the father dead, the clan abandoned the family, abandoned them, a widow and her children, on the steppe, to die in all probability. Because without the protection of a clan, without the collective resource of a tribal group, survival in that landscape was desperately uncertain. They did not die. Temujin's mother, Hoelun, was a woman of extraordinary tenacity, and she kept her children alive through those years by foraging, digging roots, catching fish and small animals, doing whatever was necessary. Temujin grew up in poverty and danger, learning early the lessons of vulnerability and the lessons, equally important, of how to survive it. There were captures. There was a period when Temujin was enslaved by a rival clan, forced to wear a kangwe, a heavy wooden collar, and kept under close guard before he managed to escape with the help of a sympathetic family. There were raids and counter-raids, alliances formed and broken, the constant violent chess of steppe politics. And through all of it, Temujin was building something, slowly, carefully, with a combination of military genius, political intelligence, and a quality that the sources keep returning to, a personal magnetism an ability to inspire loyalty in the men who followed him that was quite distinct from the ordinary calculations of steppe alliance making. What made Temujin different? What would eventually make him Genghis Khan? Was not simply that he was a gifted warrior, though he was. It was that he understood something about the structural weakness of steppe society and set about, deliberately and systematically, to fix it. Steppe tribes were organized around kinship. Loyalty ran along bloodlines. A man's obligations were to his clan, his tribe, his family. This made the steppe world intensely fractious. Alliances between tribes were fragile because they were always secondary to the primary loyalty of blood. Betrayal was common. The cycle of raid and counter-raid, feud and vendetta was almost self-sustaining. Temujin broke this structure. He built an army and eventually a state, organized not around kinship, but around personal loyalty to him, and structured along military lines that cut across traditional tribal divisions. Units of 10, of 100, of 1,000, of 10,000. The decimal system of military organization that the Mongols would perfect, and that would make their armies so extraordinarily effective. Men from different tribes and different clans were mixed together in the same units, their old tribal identities deliberately diluted, their new identity, that of Mongol soldiers serving the Khan. He also, crucially, rewarded merit rather than birth. Commanders rose because they were capable, not because of who their fathers had been. This was revolutionary in a world where birth and kinship determined almost everything. It attracted talented men to his banner and created a meritocratic military elite of remarkable effectiveness. By the early years of the 13th century, Temujin had, through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and the steady accumulation of victories, united the tribes of the Mongolian steppe under his authority in a way that had never been achieved before. Rival Khans had been defeated or incorporated. The great tribal confederacies that had fragmented steppe power for generations were dissolved into a single Mongol nation. Around 1206, the date is traditional rather than precisely documented, a great assembly was called, a Kurultai, the Mongol term for a gathering of the great men of the nation, convened on the banks of the Onon River in what is now Mongolia. Representatives of all the Mongol tribes came together, and in that gathering, the assembled chiefs and commanders confirmed Temujin as the supreme ruler of all the Mongols. They gave him a title, Genghis Khan. The precise meaning of the title has been debated by scholars for centuries. Genghis is often translated as universal or oceanic, suggesting a ruler whose authority extends in all directions, like the ocean that surrounds all land. Khan was the standard Turkic and Mongolian title for a ruler or chief, universal ruler, the Khan of all Khans. It was an extraordinary claim, and Genghis Khan spent the rest of his life, and his successors spent the rest of the century, making it something very close to literally true. The conquests that followed the Kurultai of 1206 are almost impossible to convey in their full scope without the mind simply declining to process the scale of what is being described. In the years immediately following his elevation, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the settled civilizations that bordered the steppe, the Tangut kingdom of Xixia, in what is now northwestern China, the Jurchen Jin dynasty ruling northern China. Campaign after campaign, city after fortified city, the Mongol armies, using a combination of their extraordinary cavalry mobility and increasingly siege technology they had acquired and adapted from conquered peoples, took what had seemed untakeable. Then west, the Khwarezmian Empire, a great Islamic state stretching across Central Asia, covering what is now Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and surrounding territories, was destroyed in a campaign of terrifying speed and systematic devastation. The great cities of Central Asia, cities that had been centers of Islamic civilization for centuries, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Nishapur, were sacked. Some of them were not merely sacked, but annihilated, their populations killed, their irrigation systems destroyed, the agricultural basis of their existence wrecked in ways that, in some cases, the land has not fully recovered from to this day. The destruction of Merv, which had been one of the great cities of the Islamic world, is described in sources with numbers that historians debate. Hundreds of thousands killed, the city reduced to rubble. Whether the precise figures are accurate or not, the reality of mass destruction on an almost incomprehensible scale is not seriously in doubt. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during a campaign against the Tangut. The cause of his death is uncertain. A fall from a horse, perhaps, or illness. He was buried, according to Mongol tradition, in an unmarked grave, the location of which was kept secret and has never been found. He had not finished. His successors, his sons and grandsons, inheriting both the empire and the drive to expand it, carried the conquest forward. Ogedei Khan, his son and chosen successor, pushed further into China, completing the destruction of the Jin dynasty in the north, and turned west into Europe. In 1241, Mongol armies under Batu Khan and the brilliant general Subutai smashed the Hungarian kingdom at the Battle of Mohi and destroyed a Polish-German force at Legnica in the same week. Two major battles, hundreds of miles apart, won simultaneously, a feat of strategic coordination that stunned the watching world. Western Europe trembled. There seemed to be nothing between the Mongol armies and the Atlantic. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II sent urgent letters. The Pope prayed and pleaded for unity among the Christian princes. England's King Henry III reportedly considered fleeing to the coast and taking ship. And then, in 1241, Ogedei Khan died in distant Mongolia. The Mongol commanders had to return for the Kurultai to choose his successor. The armies pulled back from Europe. They never returned, not in that form, not with that momentum. Europe was spared, though it did not know for some years that the danger had passed. Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, turned south and west in the 1250s. In 1258, his armies took Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate, the great center of Islamic civilization, the city that had been the intellectual and political heart of the Islamic world for 5 centuries. The last Abbasid caliph was executed. The great library of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, which had preserved and translated and extended the philosophical and scientific knowledge of the ancient world, was destroyed. Books thrown into the Tigris, it is said, in such numbers that the water ran black with ink. The Mongol advance into the Islamic heartland was finally stopped in 1260 at the Battle of Ain Jalut in what is now Israel, stopped by the Mamluks of Egypt, the only major Islamic power that had not been crushed, and who proved on that day that the Mongols could be defeated in open battle. But the damage was done. The Abbasid Caliphate was gone. The great urban civilization of Mesopotamia was shattered. Iraq, which had been one of the most agriculturally productive and densely populated regions of the world, lost a significant portion of its population and saw its intricate irrigation systems destroyed, consequences from which the region recovered only slowly over many generations. And yet, and this is one of history's most persistent complexities, the Mongol Empire was not only destruction. The Great Mongol Peace, the Pax Mongolica, as later historians called it, that settled over the vast conquered territories in the mid-13th century, created conditions for trade and cultural exchange on a scale the world had not seen before. The Silk Road, those ancient trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, functioned under Mongol protection with a regularity and safety they had rarely known. Merchants could travel, in theory at least, from one end of the Eurasian continent to the other under a single imperial authority. Ideas and goods and technologies moved along these routes. Chinese papermaking and printing techniques moved westward. Islamic astronomy and mathematics continued their transmission into European scholarship. Diplomatic contacts between the Mongol courts and both the papacy and the courts of Western Europe produced some of the most remarkable travel literature of the medieval world. The journeys of William of Rubruck, of John of Plano Carpini, and most famously of Marco Polo, whose account of his years at the court of Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, who ruled China as the first Yuan emperor, introduced the European imagination to a world of almost incomprehensible richness and sophistication. The Black Death too moved along the Mongol trade route. The plague that would devastate both Asia and Europe in the mid-14th century was spread, in part, by the very connectivity that the Mongol Peace had created. History gives and takes with the same hand. The Mongol Empire did not survive as a unified entity. It was too large, too diverse, too dependent on the personality and authority of particular rulers to hold together across generations. By the late 13th century, it had fragmented into 4 great successor states: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppe. Each developed in its own direction, each absorbed and was absorbed by the cultures it ruled. Each left its own particular deposit in the sediment of history. The Golden Horde's dominion over the Russian principalities, what Russian historians call the Tatar yoke, lasted for roughly 2.5 centuries, and its effects on the development of Russian political culture, on the relationship between Russian rulers and their subjects, on the very character of the Russian state that eventually emerged under Moscow's leadership, are still debated by historians. Some see the later absolutism of the Russian Tsars as shaped in part by the Mongol model of sovereignty. Others argue this gives the Mongols too much credit or too much blame. In Persia and the Middle East, the Ilkhanate gradually converted to Islam and became part of the Islamic world it had conquered. Mongol rulers became Muslim rulers. The conquerors were absorbed by what they had absorbed. It is one of history's most recurring patterns. Temujin, the boy abandoned on the steppe, with his widowed mother and his siblings, who ate roots and caught fish to survive, who was enslaved and escaped, who built alliances and broke them and built better ones, who looked at the fractious, fragmented world of the steppe and saw, somehow, a different possibility. The distance between that cold, hungry boy on the Mongolian steppe and the universal ruler proclaimed at the Kurultai of 1206 is one of the great individual journeys in human history. We can admire the intelligence and the will it represents, while holding honestly and clearly the cost at which it was purchased, the millions of lives lost, the cities reduced to rubble, the civilizations disrupted or destroyed, the landscapes scarred in ways that lasted for generations. History rarely offers us the comfort of simple judgments. Genghis Khan is perhaps the most extreme example of that truth that the medieval world contains. A mind of extraordinary capacity, a will of extraordinary force, and consequences radiating outward from that cold riverbank in Mongolia in 1206 that touched the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the largest empire the world has ever seen. The steppe is still there. The grass still runs to every horizon. The sky still presses down, enormous and unmediated. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is a national hero. His face on the currency, his name on the airport, a vast steel statue of him on horseback gleaming on a hillside east of the capital Ulaanbaatar, visible from miles away. History, as we have said before, looks different depending on where you are standing. Somewhere beneath the Mongolian earth, in a location kept secret for 8 centuries, the man himself lies in his unmarked grave, undiscovered, undisturbed, waiting, perhaps, for a future that has not yet arrived. Let the steppe be still. Let the grass move in the wind. 3 more stories remain. 3 more moments from the medieval world, each carrying its own weight, its own long shadow. But for now, rest. The history has already happened. It will wait for you. Chapter 8. The Magna Carta Crisis. We return to England. It has been a while since we were last here. In our 3rd story, we stood on the shore of a cold channel and watched a king come home from exile. Æthelred returning to a kingdom that had asked for him back on conditions. We noted, quietly, that something unusual had happened there. A king who came home on terms, a negotiation between a ruler and the ruled, fragile and practical, and not quite like anything that had happened before. That was 1014. 200 years have passed since then, in the world of our story. The Danish conquest that seemed undone in 1014 was completed by 1016, and then, 50 years after that, the Normans came. William the Conqueror crossing the Channel in 1066, winning at Hastings, remaking the English ruling class entirely, layering a French-speaking Norman aristocracy over the Anglo-Saxon world beneath. The England of 1215 is, in its upper reaches, still that Norman England, French in its court language, continental in its dynastic connections, ruled by a king whose family came originally from Anjou in western France. That king is John. And John, by the summer of 1215, is in very serious trouble. To understand John, it helps to understand the family he came from. The Plantagenets, or the Angevins, as historians often call the earlier members of the dynasty, were not a family that encouraged comfortable feelings. They were brilliant, energetic, difficult, and prone to spectacular conflict, including with one another. John's father was Henry II, a king of formidable intelligence and administrative genius who had built an empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, who had reformed English law in ways that still echo in the common law tradition today, and who had also, in a moment of terrible consequence, spoken words that led his knights to murder the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, in his own cathedral. Henry died in the end, having been betrayed by his own sons, who rebelled against him in alliance with the King of France. He died, it is said, having just learned that the youngest of those sons, the one he had trusted most, the one he had tried hardest to protect, had joined the rebellion against him. That younger son was John. John's brother was Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, the crusading king, the warrior who spent most of his reign away from England, and yet remained one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history, celebrated for exactly the qualities of martial glory and chivalric display that the medieval world valued most. John inherited, after Richard's death in 1199, an enormous realm and a nearly impossible set of problems. The central problem was France. The Plantagenet kings held vast territories in France: Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and through marriage, Aquitaine in the south. These were not colonies or distant possessions. They were the heartland of the dynasty, the places these kings felt most at home, the lands that connected them to the broader world of French aristocratic culture. Ruling them required constant vigilance, constant campaigning, constant diplomacy, and ruling them required money, enormous, relentless quantities of money. Against John stood Philip II of France, Philip Augustus, one of the great kings of medieval France, a patient and exceptionally capable ruler who had spent his reign methodically extending French royal power at the expense of his great noble vassals. Philip had been working for years to find the legal and political levers by which he could strip the Plantagenets of their French holdings. In 1202, he found his moment. John, through a combination of recklessness and miscalculation, gave Philip the pretext he needed. Philip declared John's French lands forfeit, and then, over the following years, he took them. Normandy fell in 1204. Anjou fell. Maine fell. The ancestral heartland of the Plantagenet dynasty, the territories that Henry II had built into an empire, were lost with a speed that seemed almost impossible, and that left John's reputation as a king, as a commander, as a man in ruins. The chroniclers called him John Softsword, and worse things. In a world where a king's capacity to lead armies and hold territory was the primary measure of his fitness to rule, John had failed the most basic test. He spent the years after 1204 trying to recover what he had lost, and trying to recover it required money, more money than England had ever been asked to provide before. John was, by most accounts, an intelligent and administratively capable king. Whatever his failures in the field, he was attentive to the details of governance in a way that his predecessors had not always been. He knew his kingdom. He traveled it constantly. He involved himself in the workings of his courts and his treasury, and he used every tool available to him, legal, financial, feudal, to extract the resources he needed for the war he was planning. He levied taxes. He exploited his feudal rights over the great barons with a thoroughness that felt, to those barons, like extortion. When a baron died and his heir needed to pay to inherit his lands, John set the relief, the inheritance payment, at whatever level he felt he could get away with. When barons needed royal favor, John made them pay for it. When they fell out of favor, he took hostages, seized lands, demanded guarantees of good behavior that looked more like ransom than law. he also had a habit of making enemies in ways that seemed almost compulsive. He was suspicious, vindictive, prone to humiliating those who crossed him. He had a sardonic intelligence that expressed itself too often as cruelty. The great barons of England, who were themselves powerful, proud men with long memories and strong opinions about what a king was and was not entitled to do, accumulated grievances against John year by year. And in 1214, John's great plan for recovering France collapsed. His allies, including the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, were defeated by Philip Augustus at the Battle of Bouvines, a crushing, definitive French victory that ended any realistic prospect of recovering Normandy and Anjou. John himself had been campaigning in the south, in Poitou, and had achieved nothing. He came home to England having spent an enormous fortune and accomplished nothing. The barons were waiting for him. The rebellion that followed was not initially idealistic. Let us be clear about that, in the way that honest history requires. The barons who rose against John in the spring of 1215 were not philosophers or constitutionalists. They were powerful men who were angry about specific grievances, the extortionate reliefs, the arbitrary seizures, the hostage-taking, the sense that John's exercise of royal power had broken the unwritten but understood rules of the feudal relationship. They were also men who had been in contact with each other, who had been building their coalition carefully, and who understood that if they were going to confront the king, they needed to do it with enough force that he could not simply pick them off one by one. By May 1215, the rebel barons had captured London, an enormous blow to John's position, since London's wealth and walls were a crucial strategic asset. John, suddenly without the ability to simply suppress the rebellion by force, had to negotiate. The negotiations took place at Runnymede, a water meadow on the south bank of the Thames, between Windsor and Staines, a neutral ground between the king at Windsor Castle and the rebel army at Staines. In mid-June 1215, the two sides met there, and what emerged from those meetings was a document, Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It is, in its original form, a long and rather specific document. Much of it is concerned with the particular feudal grievances of the particular barons who were present at Runnymede, the precise regulation of reliefs and wardships and widows' rights, and the behavior of royal officials. It reads, in large portions, like exactly what it was, a negotiated settlement between a king and his barons, hammered out under duress, addressing the specific complaints of specific powerful men. But embedded within it, among the clauses about fish weirs and the standardization of weights and measures and the regulation of the forest law, were several passages of a different character, passages that reached beyond the particular disputes of 1215 toward something more general. Clause 39 is the most famous. No free man, it says, shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or his possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. And clause 40, to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. These are not complex sentences. They do not require legal training to understand. And in their clarity, in their apparent simplicity, lay their remarkable durability. John had no intention of honouring the charter. Almost certainly, he had agreed to it only to buy time, to get through the immediate crisis, to separate the rebel barons from their cause, and then to find a way to reassert his authority. Within weeks of sealing it, he had sent to Pope Innocent III, his feudal overlord, since John had submitted England to the papacy as a papal fief in 1213 in exchange for political support, asking for the charter to be annulled. Innocent, who had his own reasons for supporting royal authority against baronial rebellion, obliged. He annulled Magna Carta in August 1215, condemning it as shameful, demeaning, illegal, and unjust. The barons, predictably, were not willing to accept this. They invited Louis, the son of Philip Augustus of France, to come and take the English throne. A French prince with a French army landed in England. Civil war, the First Barons' War, erupted. And then John died, October 1216, at Newark, of dysentery. Worn out by a campaign that was going badly, having just lost his baggage train, including, according to the most dramatic accounts, the royal treasure to the incoming tide in the Wash. He was 49 years old. His heir was his 9-year-old son, Henry III. And here is where something unexpected happened, something that transformed a failed peace treaty into a foundational document. The men who governed England in Henry's name, the regent William Marshal, one of the most celebrated knights of the age, and the papal legate Guala, needed to win the civil war. They needed to bring the rebel barons back to the royal side, and to do that, they needed to offer them something. They reissued Magna Carta. In November 1216, in the name of the child king, a revised version of the charter was issued as a gesture of good faith, a promise that the new reign would be conducted differently from the old. Some of the most contentious clauses were removed. The document was shortened and simplified. It worked. Rebel barons began to return to Henry's side. The French Prince Louis, without enough English support, eventually withdrew. The Civil War ended. Magna Carta was reissued again in 1217 and again in 1225. In a form that was closer to the document, it would eventually become in legal memory. Each reissue confirmed and deepened the Charter's authority. Each reissue transformed it a little more from a specific crisis settlement into something that looked more like a general statement of principle. By 1297, it was formally enrolled in the statute rolls of England, part of the law of the land in a formal, lasting sense. The later life of Magna Carta is in some ways more remarkable than its birth. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when the English Parliament was locked in its great constitutional struggle with the Stuart kings, lawyers and parliamentarians reached back to Magna Carta and found in it what they needed. Sir Edward Coke, the great common lawyer and champion of parliamentary rights against James I and Charles I, interpreted Magna Carta as the foundational statement of English liberties, as proof that the rights of the subject against arbitrary royal power were ancient, established, inalienable. This was, in some respects, a creative reading. The barons of 1215 had not been thinking about the rights of ordinary English subjects. They had been thinking about their own feudal rights and their own particular grievances. The clause about freemen was, in the context of 1215, primarily about freemen of property, not about the broad mass of the English population. most of whom were unfree in various degrees. But Coke and his colleagues were not wrong to see something real in the document. The principle that the king was under law, that royal power had limits, that those limits could be stated and enforced, was genuinely there. It had been stated, however imperfectly and however self-interestedly, in that water meadow on the Thames in June 1215. The American colonists knew Magna Carta. When they argued against taxation without representation, when they insisted on the right to trial by jury, when they demanded that government operate under law rather than by arbitrary power, they were drawing on a tradition of English constitutional thought that ran back in a direct line to Runnymede. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law," is a direct descendant of Clause 39 of Magna Carta, filtered through 7 centuries of legal development and constitutional thought, a document sealed under duress in a water meadow by a king who intended to break it, speaking eventually to the framers of a constitution on the other side of the world, more than 5 centuries later. Runnymede is a quiet place. It sits beside the Thames, in the gentle Surrey countryside, the river moving past with its usual unhurried English patience. There are memorials there now, including one erected by the American Bar Association in recognition of Magna Carta's role in the American legal tradition. The meadow itself is managed by the National Trust, and on an ordinary day, you might walk across it and feel nothing in particular, just grass and river and the sound of birds. But something happened there in the 3rd week of June in 1215 that has not stopped happening. A king, cornered and furious, pressed his seal to a document he hated. A set of words went into the world, and those words, copied and recopied, reissued and reinterpreted, argued over and appealed to and built upon across 8 centuries, became part of the foundation of something we still, in our better moments, aspire to. The idea that power has limits, that justice is not for sale, that no one, not even a king, stands above the law. It began in a water meadow on a June morning with a reluctant king and an angry set of barons and a document that almost nobody, in that moment, expected to last. Let that rest now. The meadow and the river and the quiet persistence of a few written words across the centuries. 2 stories remain, 2 more moments from the medieval world, each with their own weight and their own long reach. But for now, let the river move. Let the meadow be still. The history has already happened. It will wait for you. Chapter 9. The Black Death in Europe. We have been moving through the medieval world for a long time now, through battles and coronations, through schisms and conquests, through a water meadow on the Thames and a vast empire built on the open steppe. We have watched kingdoms rise and fall, watched ideas move through time like light through water, bending and shifting and illuminating unexpected things. In our 7th story, we stood at the Kurultai on the banks of the Undone River and watched Temujin become Genghis Khan, and we noted at the end of that story something that seemed almost incidental at the time, that the great connectivity of the Mongol world, the Pax Mongolica, the reopened Silk Road humming with merchants and diplomats and travelers, had moved not only goods and ideas across the Eurasian continent, but also, eventually, something else, something invisible, something that travelled in the holds of ships and the fur of rats and the bodies of fleas, moving westward along the trade routes with a patience and a thoroughness that no army could match. We arrive now at perhaps the most devastating event in the entire history of medieval Europe, the event that, more than any other, cracked the world of the High Middle Ages open and let something different begin to emerge from the wreckage, the Black Death. Before we go further, let us sit for a moment with a scale of what we are about to discuss. Because scale is everything here, and it is very easy to let numbers wash over you without feeling their weight. Historians debate the precise mortality figures, as historians always do. The evidence is incomplete, the records are fragmentary, and the plague struck different regions with different intensities. But the broad consensus is that somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's population died in the initial outbreak between 1347 and 1351. Some regions lost more. Some cities lost more than half their inhabitants in a matter of months. Europe's population in 1347 was somewhere in the range of 70 to 80 million people. The numbers who died in those 4 years were counted in the tens of millions. Let that be still for a moment, not as a statistic, but as a human reality. Tens of millions of individual people, each with a name, a family, a particular face and voice and way of moving through the world. Gone in 4 years, in a catastrophe so swift and so total that the survivors struggled to find language adequate to describe it. The plague, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, and in its pulmonary form, pneumonic plague, had been moving westward for years before it reached Europe. It had devastated populations across Central Asia and the Middle East in the early 1340s. It reached the Crimea on the northern shore of the Black Sea, where Genoese merchants maintained trading ports that connected the Silk Road networks to the Mediterranean world. There is a story told by a contemporary chronicler named Gabriele de Mussi of the siege of the Crimean port of Kaffa, where a Mongol army, itself ravaged by plague, catapulted the bodies of the dead over the city walls. Whether this was the precise mechanism of transmission or whether the Genoese merchants of Kaffa simply acquired the disease through the ordinary proximity of a plague-stricken population, the result was the same. The merchants sailed home, and the plague sailed with them. It reached Sicily in October 1347. It reached Genoa and Venice and Marseille before the end of the year, and then it moved inland and north and in every direction simultaneously, following the roads and the rivers and the trade routes with a terrible fidelity, the very networks of connection and commerce that had made medieval Europe prosperous, now serving as the channels through which death flowed. The experience of the plague, for those who lived through it, was unlike anything in living memory, unlike anything, perhaps, in the memory of the civilization itself. The symptoms of bubonic plague, the swellings in the lymph nodes of the groin and armpit and neck, the buboes that gave the disease one of its names, black and agonizing, sometimes the size of an egg or an apple, appeared within days of infection. Fever followed, and delirium and hemorrhaging beneath the skin that turned the flesh dark. Most of those who developed full symptoms were dead within a week, some within days. Pneumonic plague, the pulmonary form, spreading directly through the air from person to person, was faster still and almost universally fatal. What made it so psychologically devastating, beyond the physical horror, was the speed. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. Communities that had existed for generations were emptied in weeks. Whole villages fell silent. Priests refused to administer last rites, terrified of contagion. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. In some cities, mass graves were dug and filled and dug again. Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence in 1348 and wrote about it in the introduction to the Decameron, describes the city with a precision that is almost unbearable to read. Neighbor abandoned neighbor, husband abandoned wife, parents abandoned children. The social fabric, the web of obligation and care and mutual responsibility that holds communities together, simply dissolved in many places under the pressure of fear. And yet, in other places and among other people, the opposite happened. Communities drew together. People cared for strangers. Religious houses nursed the sick until there was no one left to nurse. Human beings, faced with the worst, produced both the worst and the best of themselves, as they tend to do. The search for explanation, for a reason, for someone to blame, was urgent and, in many cases, terrible. The learned physicians of medieval Europe, working within the framework of classical medicine inherited from Galen and Avicenna, understood disease in terms of miasma, bad air, corrupted humors, astrological influences. A conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius in 1345 was advanced by the medical faculty of the University of Paris as a plausible cause. Remedies, strong-smelling herbs, bloodletting, avoidance of baths, were offered with more confidence than they deserved. But the need to find a human cause, a human agent for the catastrophe, turned, in many parts of Europe, against the Jewish communities that had lived alongside Christian populations for generations. The accusations spread that Jews had poisoned the wells, had deliberately introduced the plague as an act of malice against Christian society. The accusation was false, demonstrably false. The plague killed Jewish communities as thoroughly as Christian ones. But falsehood has rarely been an obstacle to persecution when fear is driving it. Pogroms swept through the Jewish communities of the Rhineland and southern France and the Crown of Aragon. Entire communities were massacred in scenes of terrible violence by populations driven to extremity by grief and fear and the ancient, ugly instinct to find a scapegoat. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls condemning the persecutions and stating clearly that the accusation of well poisoning was without foundation. Some communities were protected by their local rulers, others were not. The flagellants moved through the towns and roads of Germany and the Low Countries, groups of men who beat themselves publicly with leather straps and metal-tipped whips, performing extreme penance in the hope of propitiating divine anger, attracting crowds and controversy, and eventually papal condemnation in roughly equal measure. The world was trying desperately to make sense of what was happening to it, and not always finding its better self in the attempt. By 1351, the worst of the first wave had passed. Europe was not finished with plague. It would return again and again in further outbreaks through the 14th and 15th and into the 17th century, each one less catastrophic than the first, but still devastating in its particular localities. the plague became a permanent feature of European life, returning at irregular intervals, never quite letting the continent forget what it was capable of. But it is the consequences of the first great wave, the demographic shock of those 4 years between 1347 and 1351, that concern us most here, because those consequences were enormous, and they reached into almost every dimension of medieval life. The most immediate and, in the long run, most transformative consequence was economic. When a third to a half of the population dies in 4 years, the relationship between labor and land changes fundamentally. Medieval European society, particularly in its feudal dimensions, had rested on an abundance of labor relative to land. There were more people than there was work for them to do, which meant that landlords could set the terms. Serfs were bound to the land, obligated to work their lord's fields for little or no pay, subject to a legal and social framework that gave them very little room to negotiate. After the Black Death, the arithmetic was reversed. There were fewer people than the land required. Workers were scarce. And scarce workers, even in a feudal society, even in a society with powerful legal mechanisms for keeping people in their place, have options that abundant workers do not have. They could move, and many did, migrating to towns, to other manors, to wherever wages were higher. Landlords who needed their fields worked had to compete for the labor to work them. Wages rose sharply and persistently, despite the efforts of governments across Europe to legally suppress them. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving between employers. It was widely evaded. The old certainties of the feudal order began, slowly and unevenly, to dissolve. Not everywhere at once, and not without fierce resistance from those whose wealth and power depended on maintaining the old arrangements. But the direction of movement was clear, and the plague had set it in motion. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, that extraordinary moment when a large army of common people marched on London, when the young King Richard II rode out to meet them at Smithfield, when the rebel leader Wat Tyler was killed and the king made promises he did not intend to keep, was not caused by the Black Death alone, but it was made possible by it. The generations that grew up in the aftermath of the plague knew, or had been told, that their labor had value, that they were not simply fixed points in an immovable social order, that the world could be different from what it was. The demand of the rebels at Smithfield for the abolition of serfdom, for freedom of movement, for the right to rent land at fair rates rather than labor under feudal obligation, would not be immediately granted, but it would eventually, in England as across much of Western Europe, largely come to pass. Serfdom in Western Europe faded across the 15th century, not because of any single act of legal abolition, but because the economic and demographic conditions that had sustained it were gone. The Church did not emerge from the plague unscathed. In some respects, it emerged more damaged than any other institution in medieval society. The clergy had been on the front lines, priests and monks and friars, whose duties required them to be present with the dying, to administer the last rites, to bury the dead, had died in enormous numbers. Some religious houses lost their entire communities. Some parishes were left without a priest for years. The Church which had positioned itself as the mediator between humanity and God, as the institution through which divine grace was channeled, found itself unable to explain why the grace had apparently been withheld. The theology of suffering, the idea that affliction was a divine test, that patience and faith and penance would bring God's mercy, ran up against the reality that the faithful were dying in exactly the same numbers as the faithless, that priests who administered the sacraments died alongside those who had never received them, that prayer and pilgrimage and confession seemed to avail nothing against the buboes and the fever. Doubt, already present at the edges of medieval religious culture, found new space to grow. Not doubt in God exactly. The medieval world was not ready for that, and it would be several more centuries before European thought arrived at that particular shore. But doubt in the institutions and the intermediaries. Doubt in the Church's claim to unique authority over the relationship between the human and the divine. New forms of personal piety flourished, direct, emotional, individual, mysticism, lay religious movements, the sense that the individual soul could encounter God without the full apparatus of institutional mediation. It is a long and winding road from the Black Death to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, and we should not draw the line too straight or too quickly. But the road is there. There is something else worth holding in the quiet of this late hour. The plague changed the European imagination. It entered the art and the literature and the music of the 14th and 15th centuries and left marks that are still visible today. The dance of death, the danse macabre, became one of the great recurring images of late medieval art. Death personified, a skeletal figure leading people of every rank and station in a final dance. The Pope and the Emperor, the merchant and the peasant, the young mother and the old man, all led away by the same grinning companion, all equal in the end. It is a deeply democratic image in its way. Death, the great leveller, the Decameron of Boccaccio, which begins in the horror of Florence in 1348 and then retreats to a country villa where 10 young people tell each other stories while the plague rages in the city below, is one of the masterworks of European literature, and it could only have been written by someone who had seen what Boccaccio had seen. The stories are funny, bawdy, human, alive. They are a declaration that life persists, that the human appetite for pleasure and story and connection does not die even in the shadow of catastrophe. Perhaps that is one of the things the Black Death teaches us, if we let it, that human beings are more resilient than the worst that happens to them. The communities shatter and reconstitute themselves, that the world continues, altered and scarred but continuing, and that the people who survive find ways, sometimes beautiful, sometimes heartbreaking, to live in the world that the disaster has made. There are places in Europe where the Black Death is still present in the landscape, if you know how to look. The deserted medieval villages of England, the grass-covered humps and hollows that mark where houses and churches once stood, sometimes owe their desertion to the plague. Communities that fell below the critical mass needed to sustain themselves, that were quietly absorbed into neighboring settlements, leaving nothing behind but those gentle earthworks in a field. The hill towns of Tuscany, some of them, are smaller than they once were, their old walls enclosing more space than the current population requires. The memory of a larger, busier past preserved in the generous dimensions of their piazzas and their churches. In the churchyards of old European towns, there are sometimes sections where the graves are unusually dense, unusually close together, dating from the same narrow window of years in the late 1340s. The evidence, quiet and patient, of what passed through. The world that emerged from the Black Death was not the world that had existed before it. The feudal order was weakened, the church's authority was shaken. The relationship between labor and land was permanently altered. A new Europe was, slowly and painfully, beginning to assemble itself from the wreckage of the old. The Renaissance, the age of exploration, the Reformation, all of them are, in various ways, shaped by what happened between 1347 and 1351. The plague cracked the medieval world open, and through the crack, eventually, the modern world began to emerge. Let that settle now. The grass-covered humps of deserted villages, the mass graves filled and filled again, the survivors blinking in the light of a changed world, trying to understand what had happened and what came next. One story remains, the last of our 10, the final moment in our quiet journey through the medieval world. Rest now, if you like. Let the night be still around you. Let the images of this long evening drift and soften. The last story will be here when you are ready. The history has already happened. It will wait for you. Chapter 10. The Fall of Constantinople. We have arrived at the last story. 10 moments from the medieval world, each carrying its own weight, its own particular texture of consequence. We began in an autumn field in Francia, with Charles Martel and his wall of ice. We end tonight in a city, the greatest city of the medieval world. In many ways, the greatest city of the ancient world too. A place that had stood at the center of civilization for more than 1,000 years. Constantinople. We have visited it before, in the course of this evening. We were there in 1054 when Cardinal Humbert walked into Hagia Sophia and placed his document of excommunication on the high altar, and when the Patriarch's council responded in kind, and the Christian world cracked along a line that has never fully healed. We touched on it in our 5th story when we discussed the Byzantine Empire reeling from Manzikert, its Anatolian heartland slipping away, its emperors beginning to appeal westward for help that would prove complicated and ambivalent. And we noted in our 6th story that the 4th Crusade, that catastrophic diversion of a crusading army in 1204, had sacked Constantinople itself, had broken open its churches and stripped its reliquaries and carted its treasures away to Venice. A wound, we said, from which Byzantine trust in the Latin West never fully recovered. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had been shrinking for 2 centuries. What remained was barely an empire at all, a city essentially. Constantinople itself, with some coastal territories and a few scattered possessions. The great Anatolian interior was gone. The Balkans were largely gone. The empire of Justinian and Basil II and the Comnenian dynasty, the empire that had kept Roman civilization alive through the dark centuries of the early medieval world, had contracted to a single, magnificent, exhausted city on a peninsula between 2 seas. And around that city, the Ottoman Empire had grown. The Ottomans were, in their origins, one of the many small Turkic principalities that had emerged in Anatolia in the aftermath of the Mongol disruptions of the 13th century. Named for their founding leader Osman, they had expanded steadily and over the 14th and early 15th centuries, with remarkable speed and effectiveness. They had crossed into Europe, into the Balkans, in the 1350s, and had spent the following century extending their authority across Thrace, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Macedonia, incorporating the Christian kingdoms and principalities of southeastern Europe into an expanding imperial structure. Constantinople, by the middle of the 15th century, was surrounded. Ottoman territory on every side, separated from the remaining fragments of Byzantine power by Ottoman-controlled land and water. The city was an island of a civilization that had otherwise already ended. The man who came to finish it was 21 years old. Mehmed II had come to the Ottoman throne for the second time in 1451. He had briefly been sultan as a young teenager before court politics had maneuvered him aside in favor of his father, Murad II. When Murad died, Mehmed returned, and from the very beginning of his second reign, it was clear that he had one overriding ambition. He had grown up with Constantinople in his imagination. He had read about it. He was, by all accounts, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity and wide learning, speaking multiple languages, interested in history and science and art. He knew what Constantinople was. He knew what it meant. He knew that the city the Romans had called the New Rome, that the Byzantine world called simply the city, as if there were no other worth naming, was the greatest prize available to any ruler in his world. He wanted it. He had always wanted it, and he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to take it. The preparations began almost immediately after he took the throne. Mehmed commissioned the construction of a new fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus. Rumeli Hisari, the throat cutter, the Byzantines called it, understanding exactly what it meant, positioned to control the strait and cut the city. Off from supplies coming from the Black Sea, he gathered an army. He gathered artillery. The artillery is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is one of the details that makes 1453 feel like a threshold, a moment when the medieval world is visibly giving way to something different. Mehmed had commissioned from a Hungarian engineer named Urban a cannon of extraordinary size, a bombard capable of firing stone balls of enormous weight over considerable distances. The walls of Constantinople, the Theodosian walls, the great triple line of fortifications that had protected the city for 1,000 years, that had turned back Avars and Arabs and Bulgars and Russians and every army that had ever come against them, were built for an age before gunpowder artillery. They were among the finest defensive fortifications in the ancient world, but they had not been built with this in mind. The cannon took 2 months to cast. It required 60 oxen and 200 men to move it from its place of construction to the walls of Constantinople. And when it fired, a sound audible, it was said, from miles away, it sent a stone ball weighing several hundred kilograms into the ancient walls and shook them. The medieval world was ending. You can hear it in the sound of that cannon. The Byzantine emperor who faced this assault was Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor, a man who knew almost certainly that what was coming could not be survived, and who chose nonetheless to stay. He had sent appeals to the West, to the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa, to the kings of Western Europe. Help us, he had said, in various forms and through various channels for years. The city is all that remains. Help us hold it. The West's response was partial, complicated, and ultimately insufficient. A Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani arrived with a small force of experienced soldiers and proved to be an invaluable asset in the defense. A handful of Venetian ships stayed in the harbor. Some volunteers came, but the great crusading army that Constantine needed, the force that might actually have been able to relieve the city, never materialized. The old story playing out one final time. The appeal from the east. The West distracted, divided, arriving too late or not at all. There had been one last attempt at religious union. The Byzantine Church, formally accepting the authority of Rome at the Council of Florence in 1439 in exchange for the promise of Western military aid. It was a painful capitulation for the Orthodox East, and it satisfied almost no one. Many in Constantinople preferred, as one prominent Byzantine official reportedly put it, the turban of the Sultan to the cardinal's hat of Rome. The union was deeply unpopular within the city, and the military aid it was supposed to purchase never came in meaningful force. The siege began on the 6th of April, 1453. The Ottoman army was enormous. Estimates vary, as they always do for medieval armies, but the Byzantines were outnumbered by a very large margin. The defending force inside the city was small. Contemporary accounts suggest around 7,000 defenders, soldiers, and armed civilians together, stretched along miles of walls. For nearly 7 weeks, the Ottoman artillery hammered the Theodosian walls. Each night, the defenders worked to repair what the day's bombardment had broken, filling the gaps with rubble and timber and earth, improvising desperately against the rhythm of destruction. The great cannon fired several times a day. It took time to cool and reload, but each shot did damage. The walls, which had stood for 1,000 years, were being reduced section by section. Mehmed tried other approaches. A chain stretched across the Golden Horn. The inlet of water on the city's northern side blocked the Ottoman fleet from attacking from that direction. Mehmed responded by hauling his ships overland on greased logs over the hill behind Galata and launching them into the Golden Horn behind the chain. An extraordinary feat of engineering and will, and a demonstration of the Ottoman capacity for lateral thinking in the face of obstacles. The defenders watched from their walls as dozens of Ottoman ships appeared, impossibly in the water behind them, and understood that their situation had become worse still. The final assault came in the early hours of the 29th of May, 1453. Mehmed had tried 2 major assaults already, and they had been repulsed. The defenders fighting with a ferocity that surprised the attackers, holding the walls despite their numbers, inspired by a combination of genuine courage and the knowledge that there was nowhere to retreat to. The city was all there was. The third assault came before dawn, wave after wave of Ottoman troops pressing against the damaged walls. The irregular troops first, the Bashi bazooks, expendable and numerous, then the Anatolian infantry, and finally the elite Janissaries, the best trained, best equipped soldiers in the Ottoman army, the heart of Mehmed's military power. At a critical moment, the Genoese commander Giustiniani was wounded seriously through his armor in circumstances that are slightly unclear in the sources. He asked to be carried from the walls. Constantine reportedly begged him to stay. He was taken anyway, carried to a ship removed from the battle at the moment when his presence was most needed. Shortly afterward, a small gate, the Porta, a postern in the northern section of the walls, was found open. Whether it had been left unlocked by mistake or through treachery, or simply discovered and exploited in the confusion of the assault, Ottoman soldiers poured through it. They were inside the walls. The cry went up, "The city is taken, the city is taken." What happened to Constantine XI in those final moments is not precisely known. He was last seen, according to the accounts that have come down to us, removing his imperial insignia, the purple robes, the regalia that marked him as the successor of 1,000 years of Roman emperors, and throwing himself into the fighting on foot as a private soldier, dying, presumably, in the press of the assault, his body never definitively identified. It is a death suited to legend, and legend is exactly what it became. The last emperor of Rome, laying aside his crown and dying among his soldiers. The Greeks of later centuries kept a story alive that Constantine had not died, but had been turned to marble by an angel, preserved beneath the earth near the Golden Gate, waiting to be restored when the city was recovered. The Marble Emperor, they called him. A story of loss so profound that it required the consolation of a promised return. He never returned. The city was not recovered. Mehmed entered Constantinople on the afternoon of the 29th of May. He rode to Hagia Sophia, the great church of the Holy Wisdom, the building we visited in our fourth story, the building that had stood at the center of Byzantine civilization for 900 years. He dismounted, he entered, he picked up a handful of earth and poured it over his turban, a gesture of humility before God, a reminder to himself that the conquest was God's work and not his own pride's. And then he had Hagia Sophia converted into a mosque. The mosaics were plastered over. Minarets were eventually added to its exterior. The building that had been built as a church, that had been the heart of Eastern Christianity for nearly a millennium, became a place of Islamic worship. It remained a mosque until 1934, when Ataturk's secular Turkish Republic converted it into a museum. In 2020, it was converted back into a mosque. The building itself continues, carrying its long layered history in its stones and its arches and its great floating dome, still there, still standing, still catching the light over the Bosphorus. The consequences of 1453 radiated outward in multiple directions, as the consequences of all our stories have. The most immediate was the consolidation of Ottoman power in southeastern Europe. With Constantinople as their capital, Mehmed called it Constantiniye, and it would remain the Ottoman capital until the empire's dissolution in the 20th century. The Ottomans had a base of extraordinary, symbolic and strategic value. The city that had been the center of the Roman world, of the Byzantine world, was now the center of the Ottoman world. Mehmed styled himself with a seriousness that was not merely rhetorical. Caesar-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, the inheritor of the Roman imperial tradition. The conqueror does not always destroy what he conquers. Sometimes he claims it. The Ottoman Empire went on to become one of the great powers of the early modern world, extending its authority across the Middle East, North Africa, and deep into Central Europe. The siege of Vienna in 1529, the great Ottoman naval presence in the Mediterranean, the long centuries of Ottoman rule over the Arab world and the Balkans, all of it flowing from that morning in May 1453, when the walls finally gave way. For the scholars and intellectuals of the Byzantine world, the fall meant displacement. Greek scholars had been leaving Constantinople for some years, anticipating the inevitable, carrying their manuscripts and their knowledge westward, to Italy primarily, where the humanist culture of the early Renaissance was hungry for exactly what they brought. The classical Greek texts that the Byzantine world had preserved and studied, Plato, Aristotle, the Greek historians and dramatists and scientists, arrived in Italian cities in unprecedented quantities and with unprecedented expertise in their interpretation. Greek scholars taught in Florence and Venice and Rome. They established the philological and philosophical foundations of what would become the full flowering of the Renaissance. The connection is not simple, and we should not draw it too neatly. The Renaissance had been underway before 1453, and the transmission of Greek learning to the West had been happening through various channels for centuries. But the fall of Constantinople accelerated and deepened the process. The city's fall was, for the humanist scholars of 15th century Italy, both a catastrophe and a gift, the end of one world and a significant enrichment of the one that was replacing it. And then there were the trade routes. Constantinople had stood for centuries at the junction of the most important trade routes in the known world. The routes that connected Europe to the silks and spices of Asia, the goods that medieval Europeans valued so highly and could not produce themselves, had passed through or near the Byzantine world and its connections to the East. The Ottoman conquest did not, in the straightforward way that is sometimes claimed, simply block these routes. Trade between Europe and Asia continued through the Ottoman Empire often enough, and the Ottomans were not in principle opposed to commerce. But the terms changed, the costs changed, the uncertainties changed, and the merchants and the monarchs of Western Europe found themselves thinking with new urgency about an old question. Was there another way? Was there a route to the spices of Asia, to the pepper and cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg that flavored European food and preserved European meat and represented enormous concentrated wealth that did not pass through the hands of the Ottomans or the Venetians or any of the other intermediaries who took their portion at every stage of the journey? What if you went around Africa perhaps, and east across the Indian Ocean, or west across the Atlantic, into whatever lay on the other side? The Portuguese had been working their way down the African coast for decades, driven by a combination of commercial ambition and genuine geographical curiosity. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by sea. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, crossed the Atlantic and found not Asia, but something Europe had not known existed. The age of exploration, the age of encounter, the age of European expansion across the world, with all the commerce and the conquest and the catastrophic collision of civilizations that it entailed. All of it, in some part, downstream of that morning in May 1453, the fall of a city, the rerouting of the world. We have come a long way tonight. We began in 732, in an autumn field in Francia, with Charles Martel holding a line that would shape the religious identity of Western Europe. We end in 1453, with the fall of a city that had stood for 11 centuries, and with the world already tilting toward the age of exploration, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and everything we would eventually call the modern world. 721 years, 10 moments, 10 fulcrum points where the weight of history shifted and something new became possible, or something old came finally to its end. Let us hold them together for a moment before we let them go. A battle won in an autumn field, a crown descending in a lamplit basilica, a king coming home across cold water on conditions, two great churches pulling slowly, irrevocably apart, an empire broken on a high plateau, armies marching toward Jerusalem, crying, "God wills it," a boy from the steppe who became the ruler of the largest empire the world has ever seen, a great charter sealed in a water meadow by a reluctant king, a plague moving silently along trade routes, remaking the relationship between the living and the dead, the powerful and the powerless, and a city, the greatest city in the world, falling at last to cannon and the grey light of a May dawn. Each of these moments was, in its own time, a crisis, a rupture, something that felt to the people living through it like the end of the world they had known, and each of them was, in its own way, also a beginning. The end of one thing and the start of something else, something that could not have existed without the ending that preceded it. That is what history teaches us if we let it teach us gently. That endings and beginnings are the same moment, seen from different directions. That the world is always, in every generation, in the process of becoming something it has not been before. And that the people who lived through the great disruptions, the battles and the plagues and the schisms and the conquests, find ways, most of them, most of the time, to continue, to rebuild, to tell the stories of what happened so that the stories are not lost. You have been listening for a long time now. Medieval world has moved through this quiet hour, piece by piece, story by story, each one settling into the next. The autumn field is still. The lamplit basilica has grown dark. The water meadow by the Thames is silver in moonlight. The great dome of Hagia Sophia rises over the Bosphorus, as it has always done, carrying its long history of prayer in its ancient stones. Let it all be still now. The history has already happened. It cannot be undone, and it does not need to be. It only needed to be remembered, which we have done tonight, together in the quiet. Sleep well.